We were staying at Oconee State Park in South Carolina. I'd never camped there before, but I picked it because it was rated well, had a big campground loop with good spacing between sites, and I'd heard the bathrooms were clean, which honestly mattered more to Katie than it did to me. It was the second week of October. The weather was perfect for camping. Warm during the day, dipping into the high 40s at night. Crisp and cool in the mornings, no bugs, dry air. It was the kind of weather where your coffee actually feels useful and not just something you sip out of habit. Katie and I were both 31 then. We'd been together 5 years, living in Colombia, and we'd done a good amount of camping around the southeast Pisgah, Table Rock, even as far as Shenandoah. She always preferred cabins, but I'd finally convinced her to try tent camping for 2 nights. I told her I'd handle the setup, the gear, the food, everything. She just had to enjoy it. Our spot was pretty ideal. Site number 42, tucked at the edge of a slope, with pine needles cushioning the ground and a nice flat patch for the tent. The campground had probably 40 or 50 sites, most of them full, but it never felt too crowded. Everyone was quiet at night, young families, a few older couples, even a group of scouts up the hill. The first night was great. We cooked hot dogs on the fire, drank some bourbon from plastic mugs, and played gin rummy by headlamp. The wind was steady but not too strong. We tucked in around 11. The second night was when things got strange. We spent most of the day hiking around the park's lake trail, took some photos of the leaves, and stopped by the ranger station to check the forecast. Clear skies, light breeze, no storms expected. We got back to camp just after dark, made chili on the camp stove, and watched the fire for a while. Around 10:30 or so, we turned in. I remember listening to the last few embers popping outside the tent as I drifted off. Sometime around 3:10 a.m. Don't ask how I remember the time. It was one of those nights burned into my head. I was startled awake by pressure. Not sound, not light, just pressure. Katie was smashed up against my side, trembling, not shaking from cold either. The kind of trembling where you can feel every muscle in someone's body clench all at once. Like she was trying to hold herself still but couldn't. She wasn't saying anything loud, just a fast whisper near my ear. "Babe, wake up. Please wake up." I didn't hesitate. I was fully awake immediately. I pushed up on one elbow and tried to get my bearings. The lantern we used had died earlier, and I didn't want to unzip the door and shine my flashlight outside without knowing what was going on. I whispered, "What is it?" But she just kept whispering, "Shoo," while her hand grabbed my wrist and squeezed. Then I heard it, breathing, no, more like snorting. Something was sniffing around the base of the tent on her side, where our heads were. I could hear the wet sniffling, like a big dog trying to get a scent out of the ground. Then it gave a snort, and I felt the nylon flex as something pushed against it. I froze. My first thought was raccoon. We'd seen one the night before, and I knew they'd sniff around for food scraps. But this thing wasn't pawing or scratching. It was pushing. Then it snorted again, louder this time, and I heard its breath hit the tent wall. Felt the moisture through the thin fabric. That's when I realized it was too tall to be a raccoon. The nose wasn't low to the ground. It was up by our heads, at least 3 feet off the ground, maybe more. My stomach sank. I couldn't see it, but I could picture the shape pressing against the fabric. Something broad and solid. The wall of the tent bowed inward several inches. If it was a bear, and that's where my mind immediately went, it was probably a black bear. That was the only kind around here. Black bears are usually skittish, afraid of noise, and they don't like confrontation. I'd read enough and watched enough videos to know you're supposed to shout, make yourself big, scare it off. But here's the thing, it was 3 in the morning. Dead silence across the entire campground. If I shouted and it wasn't a bear, I'd be waking up 40 other people, panicking kids, ruining everyone's night. And what if it was a person? I didn't think it was, but you never know. I didn't want to yell until I had some idea what we were dealing with. Then it pressed harder. The tent wall caved in so far I thought the fiberglass pole was going to snap. Katie clutched my arm with both hands. Her breathing was fast and shallow. I grabbed my flashlight from the pocket on the side of my sleeping bag, flicked the switch, and pointed it toward the bulge in the tent. I didn't even unzip the window. I just aimed the beam and hoped the brightness would shine through the fabric enough to scare it. It worked. The second the light hit the wall, whatever it was grunted. A low, heavy sound, and paused. I held the beam steady, waiting. It didn't move at first, just stood there, breathing, as if it was trying to decide what to do next. I didn't hear any growling or teeth or anything like that. Just that wet, labored breathing and the sound of something big shifting its weight. After what felt like a full minute but was probably 10 seconds, it stepped back. I heard the crunch of pine needles and dead leaves underfoot. Then 2 more steps. It didn't run. It didn't even walk away quickly. Just lumbered back, slow and heavy, and faded into the dark. I kept the light pointed at the tent wall, but it was gone. I didn't hear any more sounds for a while. I looked over at Katie. Her face was pale in the beam of the flashlight. We didn't talk, just lay there listening, barely moving. I didn't smell bear. I know people say you can smell them before you see them, something like wet dog mixed with rot, but I didn't catch anything like that. Then again, I wasn't exactly leaning out the door trying to get a good whiff. I just know I didn't smell anything weird, but I did hear it walk away. Whatever it was, it had weight. You could hear the ground respond to each step. That was no raccoon. I didn't sleep after that. Katie didn't either. We just lay there in the dark, not talking, not even shifting our sleeping bags. She held on to my arm the entire time. I think I kept the flashlight on for another half hour before the batteries started fading. By then, the sky had started to get a little lighter, still pitch black, but that barely there blue tinge had crept into the tree line. When the birds started calling, we finally unzipped the tent. I stepped out first, looked around. Nothing. Fire pit was untouched. Camp chairs still where we'd left them. But I did find tracks. Not deep ones. Just enough to see where something had pushed the pine needles aside near the front corner of the tent. No clear paw prints, but there was one spot where something heavy had shifted its weight, and you could see a vague shape. It didn't look like a paw, more like a hoof, but not narrow, not deer-like. Wide and flat. I still don't know what it was. Could have been a bear with a mangled foot. Could have been a wild hog, maybe. I don't know what fishers look like in the dark, but I've heard they can be aggressive. Hell, could have been a really big dog that wandered in off-leash from another site. Whatever it was big, and it wanted in. We packed up fast. Didn't even bother with breakfast. Just tossed everything in the back of the SUV, stuffed the tent down into its bag, and took off. We didn't report it. I don't know why. Maybe I should have told the rangers, but what would I have said? Something tall sniffed our tent at 3 a.m. and almost knocked it down? With no real tracks or damage, I figured they'd just chalk it up to nerves. But I know what I heard. I know how close it was. I know how it pressed against the tent so hard the poles bent. I know how big it sounded when it walked away. And that's why we don't do tent camping anymore. We'll still go out into the woods, still hike and cook over a fire and watch the stars. But from now on, it's cabins. Real walls, real doors, real locks. I still keep a flashlight by the bed. And Katie? She hasn't asked to go camping since. Last summer, my fiancée Madison and I planned a weekend camping trip at Lake James State Park in North Carolina. We were both 28 at the time and had spent a lot of weekends over the years hiking or camping around the southeast, but we'd never been to Lake James before. We'd picked it because it wasn't too far from home, just under a 2-hour drive, and we'd heard the campsites were pretty spaced out but still had decent amenities. There were over 30 of them in our section, and most of them had tents or trailers set up by the time we pulled in that Friday afternoon. We got there around 3 p.m. The weather was almost too good to be true, mid-70s, low humidity, and not a single cloud in the sky. Madison parked the SUV while I checked in at the ranger station. We had reserved campsite number 22, which was close enough to the restrooms but still gave us a good amount of privacy with a tree line behind us and no one directly to our right. We spent the first couple of hours setting up camp, pitching the tent, unloading firewood, and cracking open a couple of drinks from the cooler. It was just one of those perfect afternoons, the kind where everything falls into place without any effort. By the time the sun started to go down, we were starting to get hungry, Madison got the small propane grill going while I prepped some burger patties and cut up vegetables. The smell of food drifted through the trees, and I remember hearing other campers chatting and laughing a few sites away. Somewhere down the loop, someone had a Bluetooth speaker playing old country music just loud enough to carry. Kids were riding bikes on the gravel path. It was a peaceful little campground vibe, the kind that makes you forget about everything else. I was standing by the folding table, plating some buns, when I heard it. A voice yelling. Not just yelling, but panicked. A man's voice, loud, ragged, the kind of scream that cuts right through normal noise and snaps your brain into high alert. It wasn't a fight or a drunk guy joking around. It was raw fear. Help! Somebody! I need help! I froze for half a second, holding a plate in one hand and a spatula in the other. I could tell it wasn't right. Madison looked up from the grill, eyes wide. Without thinking, I dropped the plate and sprinted toward the direction the voice was coming from, which sounded like maybe 4 or 5 sites down. As I rounded the bend, I saw him. A man in his mid-40s, big guy, maybe 6 feet tall, standing awkwardly on one leg near the edge of his campsite. He was shirtless, covered in tattoos, and clearly intoxicated. He was gripping a folding chair for balance, and I didn't even notice the blood at first. Then I looked down and saw the pool forming around his bare foot, dark red spreading through the dirt like oil on pavement. His ankle was spraying blood in pulses. It was coming out fast, in rhythmic jets, and I swear I could hear it hitting the ground. It was the kind of injury you don't forget once you've seen it in real life. I had no medical training, but even I knew an artery was likely involved. He kept muttering something about a knife, how he dropped it, and then something about just a scratch. But this was no scratch. It looked like someone had slashed a garden hose. Madison was right behind me, and thank God she was. She has a much higher tolerance for this kind of thing than I do. Without hesitation, she grabbed a towel off the man's camp table, dropped to her knees, and wrapped it tight around his ankle. I stood frozen for a second, fighting the wave of nausea rising in my gut. Blood has always made me feel faint, even in movies, and this was real, warm, sticky, iron-smelling blood everywhere. But adrenaline kicked in. It had to. I turned and bolted back toward our campsite to grab my phone. The sun had just dipped below the tree line, and everything was cast in that weird blue-tinted half-light. I stumbled over a tree root near our site, caught myself, and fumbled in the pocket of my backpack for my phone. When I pulled it out and saw no service flashing in the top corner, I felt my stomach drop. I tried standing on a rock. I walked in a small circle, waving my arm like an idiot. Nothing. I yelled to Madison that I had no signal. She didn't even look up. Her whole focus was on keeping the pressure on his leg, wrapping it again with a second towel she'd grabbed from his chair and trying to keep him calm. The guy was starting to look bad. Face pale, lips dry, sweat dripping down his chest. He was talking, but slurring his words, fading in and out of focus. I didn't even think. I just shouted to Madison that I was taking his truck to the hospital. It was parked crooked at the edge of his campsite, keys hanging from the ignition. I half-carried, half-dragged him into the passenger seat, which was a nightmare in itself because every movement made the blood pump harder. His leg smeared the inside of the door as I lifted it in. I felt the wetness on my hands and arms and wanted to throw up, but I shoved the door shut, slid behind the wheel, and took off. I had no clue if I was doing the right thing, but waiting for an ambulance that might take 30 minutes to find us in the middle of nowhere just didn't feel like an option. I knew from the campground map that the closest town, Morganton, had a hospital Grace Memorial. It was about 20 miles away, mostly down curving mountain roads. I drove like a maniac. Every time I glanced over, he looked worse. Slouched, pale, barely awake. He was trying to say something, but I couldn't make it out. My arms were shaking. I was gripping the wheel so hard it felt like my knuckles would tear through the skin. The inside of the truck stank of blood and sweat and stale beer. His dog was barking from the bed of the truck, a big brown mutt pacing in circles, confused and panicked. The longest stretch was the last 5 miles. I kept thinking, if he dies in this seat, I'm going to lose it. I don't know how I didn't pass out. I remember blinking hard every few seconds, just trying to stay alert. When I finally saw the blue and white sign for the ER entrance, I cut across the lot and pulled up crooked right outside the double doors. I think I honked the horn, or maybe someone saw us coming, because 2 nurses ran out before I even opened the door. The second I opened it, a small flood of blood pooled out onto the pavement. One of the nurses gasped, and I remember her yelling for a gurney. They pulled him out fast, and he was barely conscious at that point. I stood there in the blood, staring at my hands, still gripping the steering wheel even though I was already outside the truck. One of the nurses told me I could go inside, but I just shook my head. I felt like I was floating. Eventually, someone brought me water and asked me some questions. His name, what happened, when. I told them what I knew, which wasn't much. I was just a guy who'd been making burgers 10 minutes before a stranger's artery exploded. They told me he'd probably survive, that I got him there just in time. I didn't really hear the rest. I called Madison from the hospital's lobby. She answered on the first ring and told me she'd come get me right away. I hung up and sat on a plastic chair, still covered in blood, trying not to vomit or cry or both. When Madison pulled up, she had the guy's dog in the back seat. She'd stayed behind to make sure the campsite didn't get ransacked, fed the dog, and even rinsed the blood off the dirt as best she could. She looked tired but calm. We didn't say much on the drive back. I just kept replaying everything in my head. The sound of the man yelling, the way the blood shot out, the drive down the mountain roads with his foot leaking onto the floor mat. When we got back to the campsite, it was dark, real dark. Most of the campers had gone to bed or were huddled around their fires. Madison and I tried to sit by ours for a while, sipping beer, pretending it was just another night. But there was this thick tension in the air now, like something had ripped through the normalcy of everything. Then, around 10:30, headlights swept across our campsite. A beat-up black truck rumbled up and parked. The driver door creaked open, and out stepped the man, limping, foot bandaged, face pale but alive. He looked different, less drunk, more human. He had 18 stitches and said the doctor told him he would have died if we hadn't helped. He shook both our hands, said thank you in a quiet voice, and then took his dog and walked back to his site. We didn't follow. We just sat there for a while longer, letting the fire burn down to coals. We didn't sleep much that night. Every time a twig snapped, I jumped. Madison tried to keep things light, but I could tell she was shaken too. The next morning, we packed up early, skipped breakfast, and drove home in silence. I think about that night more than I probably should. About how fast something normal can turn into an emergency. About how I almost passed out at the wheel while trying to save someone I didn't even know. About how much blood a person can lose and still survive. But mostly, I think about how we didn't hesitate. We saw someone in danger and we ran toward it. We didn't know what we were doing, but we didn't freeze. We acted. That man lived. He gets to keep walking around this world because 2 strangers decided to help. And I think that's what makes it all bearable. It was terrifying, yeah, but it mattered. And that's something I'll carry with me forever. My name's Kyle, and I've always considered myself a relatively outdoorsy person. I'm 32 now, and over the years I've spent countless weekends backpacking, car camping, or just hiking through national forests with a tent strapped to my pack and no real plan beyond finding a good spot before sundown. I've always appreciated solitude and the rawness of being away from everything. No phone service, no electricity, no crowds. Just me, some trees, and a fire if I'm lucky. This trip happened 2 years ago, back in late October of 2023. My girlfriend Becca and I decided to do one last camping trip before the Colorado mountains started getting too heavy with snow. We were heading to a spot we found near a quiet stretch of forest outside of Gunnison. Legal dispersed camping on national forest land, well away from any formal campsites, just the way we liked it. Dispersed camping means no amenities at all. No water spigots, no outhouses, no trash bins. You follow leave no trace rules, including the whole business of digging a hole and doing your thing away from any water source. It's not glamorous, but you get used to it. It feels a lot more real than sitting in some campground next to 6 other families and their generators. Becca had just gotten a new compact folding shovel for the trip, one of those light, military-style ones you can clip to your pack. She was excited about it. She loves new gear, and told me she packed it up with the rest of our stuff in the gear crate in the back of the truck. I didn't think much of it at the time. The drive out from Denver took us about 5 hours. We left late Friday morning, hit a bit of traffic near Salida, and reached the dirt access road just as the sun started to fall lower in the sky. That last stretch off the paved road took a while. We followed winding, bumpy Forest Service roads until we reached a turnout Becca had found on some backpacking forum. It wasn't marked on any official map, but the coordinates led to a small flat clearing tucked between clusters of ponderosa pine and some low brush. There were some vehicle tracks and a crude fire ring, but nothing else. No one around for miles. It was perfect. By the time we parked and set up the tent, the temperature had dropped. The forecast had called for lows in the high 20s, but we figured it would be manageable with the gear we brought. We had our 0-degree sleeping bags, extra blankets, and plenty of layers. I got a fire going while Becca prepped dinner, freeze-dried chili and rice, the kind you just add boiling water to. Nothing fancy, but after a long drive and a windy setup, it hit the spot. The wind really started picking up around 10 p.m. You could hear it rushing through the trees in bursts, almost like waves rolling in and out. The tent flapped a bit, but the stakes held. We curled up in our bags, wearing base layers and wool socks, trying to stay warm. I woke up a few hours later, sometime around 2 in the morning. You know that feeling when your stomach just flips over and you suddenly go from half asleep to fully awake? That's what happened. Started as a dull twist in my gut, then escalated quickly. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. My intestines were making a sound like a haunted dishwasher. I tried to wait it out at first, hoping it was just a passing cramp. But it wasn't. It was the kind of urgency that had no patience. DEFCON 1. 0 warning, no ramp up. I needed to go right then. I fumbled for my headlamp, which was clipped to the mesh pocket on the tent wall, and slapped the button. The beam lit up the inside of the tent. Becca groaned a little in her bag, half asleep. I leaned over and muttered that I needed the shovel. She waved a hand vaguely toward the gear crate outside and mumbled something about it being in the black pouch. Then she rolled over and went back to sleep. Outside, the cold hit me like a slap. The wind was still going strong, cutting through the thin thermals I threw on as I hurried out of the tent. The air felt like it was in the low 30s at best, and the chill instantly worked its way into my sleeves and down my neck. I didn't even bother putting on my boots properly, just slipped into them without socks and half-laced them as I stumbled to the crate at the rear of the truck. I yanked off the lid and started digging through it. The crate was a big plastic bin where we tossed all our cooking gear, emergency supplies, and miscellaneous stuff that didn't go in our packs. Becca had packed most of it. I was crouching there in the dark, freezing, my gut twisting with pressure, flipping through pots, pans, bags of trail mix, an extra tarp, and some wet wipes. I couldn't find the damn shovel. My hands were shaking, partly from the cold, partly from panic. I was breathing hard, crouched over like a raccoon on meth, sweating through my base layers and trying not to shit myself in the middle of the forest. Finally, buried under a cooking pot and a roll of duct tape, I saw a small red bag, about the size of a pencil case. I grabbed it, unzipped it, and found what I assumed was the shovel. It wasn't what I expected. It was tiny, not the folding spade style I was used to, but more of a flimsy backpacker trowel made of lightweight aluminum, the kind you might get for a day hike emergency. Becca must have grabbed the wrong one, or maybe packed both and I didn't see the right one. Either way, it wasn't going to be enough. I didn't have time to care. I ran a little ways from the tent, probably not the recommended 200 feet from water or camp, but at least it was far enough to not be disrespectful, and found a semi-clear patch of earth near some rocks and sagebrush. I started digging. The ground was half frozen, hard-packed dirt with a crust of frost. The wind kept knocking the headlamp beam sideways as it flapped on my forehead, and every gust made my eyes water. The shovel, if you could even call it that, was barely making a dent. I scraped and scraped, maybe 2 inches deep, before I gave up and dropped it. I got on my knees and started clawing at the earth with my bare hands, shivering uncontrollably. When I say it was close, I mean it. I barely got my shorts down before everything let go. It wasn't solid. It was a full-blown disaster. I could feel it splattering against my thighs, and I just froze there in a half squat, trying not to cry from the mix of cold, disgust, and raw humiliation. The hole was too shallow. I tried to shift my position, but I slipped on a patch of frozen dirt and fell sideways onto one hand, which promptly sank into the mess I just made. I stayed there for a second, breathing through my nose, trying to stay calm. It wasn't even over yet. My stomach twisted again. I shifted, tried to go again, realized it was already everywhere. All I could do was sit there in the dark wind and wait for my body to stop attacking itself. When it finally did, I wiped my ass the only way I could, using the hand that was already covered in dirt and other things. I found a leaf. It didn't help. I was out of options. Back at the gear crate, I grabbed a bottle of drinking water and stripped my shorts off behind the truck, using the freezing water to rinse myself down. The cold made my teeth chatter and my knees weak. My hand was a filthy mess, and there was no way I could use soap out there without contaminating anything. So I just scrubbed it against the icy ground and doused it with what was left of the water bottle. It took me nearly 30 minutes to get back into the tent. I tossed the soiled shorts into a trash bag, climbed into my sleeping bag in my base layers, and curled into a tight ball. My body was trembling. I couldn't tell if it was from the cold or the shock of it all. I didn't sleep much the rest of the night. When the sun finally came up, it was mercifully calm. The wind had died down and a light frost coated the grass around camp. Becca sat up and stretched, yawning. I was already awake, watching the tree line through the mesh window. She unzipped the tent, walked over to the crate, and within seconds pulled out a black pouch from the side pocket, the one I had thrown aside in a panic without opening. Inside was the actual shovel, a full-size, collapsible entrenching tool with a serrated edge. It was perfect, and I never saw it in my blind scramble. I didn't say anything right away, just sat there, staring at it, trying not to relive the night. Eventually, I told her what happened. She didn't laugh, to her credit, at least not right away. But she did smile and said, "Well, now we know to pack that one in the side pocket of the pack, not the crate. Lesson learned." We stayed one more night, but I barely ate anything, too scared to have a repeat performance. The trip ended with us driving home in silence, mostly because I kept replaying the whole thing in my head. The cold, the wind, the panic. I threw those shorts away the minute we got home, and I bought my own damn shovel. I've been guiding outdoor trips for about 8 years now, mostly high school groups, kids between 15 and 17, on hiking and backcountry ski tours. My work revolves around coastal British Columbia, which is where I was born and raised, so I know these areas better than most people know their own neighborhoods. I've always found the rhythm of it peaceful. Prepping gear, organizing meals, leading long hikes over route-laced trails, teaching navigation and safety skills, and watching kids grow a little taller in their boots by the end of a trip. This particular trip took place in early July of 2017 on the rugged coast of the Brooks Peninsula on northern Vancouver Island. I was leading a group of 10 girls from a high school in the Fraser Valley. They were all around 15 or 16 years old. Some had done a bit of hiking before, but for most, it was their first time spending multiple nights in a backcountry setting. The plan was to spend 6 days on the remote beaches and headlands of the coastline, following a loosely marked route that crisscrossed forest trails, tidal shelves, and long stretches of sand and rock. It wasn't the Nootka Trail, but it had a similar wild, unregulated energy to it. No signs, no cell coverage, no one else around. You earn every kilometer you cover, and every campsite is something you build into with effort. Day 3 was where things got strange. We'd started the morning just after sunrise. The fog was lifting off the beach and the ocean was still as glass. I remember how calm everything felt. A few of the girls were already up when I crawled out of my tent. They were chatting quietly while eating instant oatmeal and drying out socks on driftwood logs. The tide was just past its low point, which meant we had about 4 hours of decent shelf walking ahead of us before we'd need to either bushwhack or set up camp again. The plan was to head south along a jagged portion of coastline with a few steep scrambles and finish the day at a small creek mouth with a wide beach, good tree cover, and flat spots for tents. We broke camp quickly. My co-guide, A woman named Leah, who had done a few of these trips with me before, helped sweep the site, making sure we hadn't left behind wrappers or random socks. She was good at staying calm, even when the kids were tired or being difficult, and between the two of us we kept the group moving at a decent pace. By mid-morning it was hot. The sun had burned off all the fog, and the tide was low enough that we could stick to the barnacle-encrusted shelf for most of the way. The girls were in good spirits. They were loud, joking around, clambering over rocks and taking pictures of tide pools. I was in the back of the group, as usual, watching for rolled ankles or stragglers, when I saw it. First, I thought it was a dog. It was on the far side of the cove we were approaching, maybe 300 meters off, and it was moving fast, not loping like a bear or trotting like a wolf. It was running low and wide, almost with a dancer's rhythm, straight along the beach. Midday sun, full exposure, nothing to hide behind. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I pulled my binoculars from my chest strap and took a better look. It was a cougar, a big one, easily over 2 meters long and lean, with a sand-colored coat that shimmered in the heat waves rising from the beach. What caught me off guard wasn't just that it was out in the open at that hour, but the way it was moving. It wasn't stealthy. It wasn't stalking or feeding or fleeing. It was zigzagging across the beach like it was agitated or confused. At one point, it sprinted down toward the tide line, then turned abruptly and bolted up into the driftwood before stopping dead and staring back across the sand in our direction. I didn't say anything right away. I just watched. I kept my distance and radioed Leah, who was maybe 200 meters ahead with the bulk of the group. I told her to stop and keep the girls together. She didn't ask questions. She trusted my instincts, and that's one of the reasons we worked well together. When I caught up, I explained what I'd seen. Her face went pale. We pulled the girls together and explained the situation, keeping it as calm and matter-of-fact as we could. We didn't want to scare them more than necessary. Cougars are solitary and stealthy. They don't want to be seen. If you spot one, it's usually just a flash before it disappears into the trees. But this thing was doing laps around an exposed beach in the full heat of the day, in late July. It made no sense. We waited a few minutes, hoping it would vanish into the forest, but it didn't. Every time we scanned the beach with binoculars, it was still there. Sometimes running, sometimes stopping to dig or paw at something, sometimes just staring down the beach like it was waiting for something to show up. We talked through options. The tide shelf extended around the base of the headland, and we could have skirted the cougar entirely by hugging the rocks and moving fast, but something about it didn't sit right. We were a large group. Statistically, cougars don't attack groups this size. But this wasn't normal cougar behavior. The girls had bear spray, and Leah and I both carried air horns and flares, but those are last resorts. The wilderness doesn't care about statistics when something's not acting right. We made the call to pull back. We returned to our previous camp, an hour back up the trail where we'd stayed the night before. It wasn't ideal, but it was defensible. Good sightlines, a flat tent area above the high tide mark, and a creek for water. We radioed for a float plane extraction. There's a landing spot about 1 kilometer south of where we saw the cougar, but the pickup requires specific tide conditions and calm seas. Unfortunately, by late afternoon the wind picked up and the swell was heaving. No way they could safely land. We were told they'd try again in the morning. That night was tense. No one said much around the fire. The girls were clearly on edge, whispering in their tents, checking their zippers and bear sprays. I did my best to reassure them, but I didn't sleep much either. Leah and I took turns staying up, just watching the tree line. I kept the flare gun close, and every little sound, twigs cracking, branches shifting, felt like something creeping closer. But nothing happened. In the morning, we packed early. We wanted to be at the pickup site with time to spare before the tide came up. The wind had died down, and the float plane pilot radioed that he'd try to land by mid-morning. We moved fast but kept tight. It was cloudy now, the light all flat and silver. I felt uneasy the entire walk, like something was just outside our sight line. When we reached the beach, the cougar was gone. No sign of it. The sand looked clean and undisturbed, and the girls immediately relaxed a little. Leah set up a signal on the beach for the float plane, bright gear and a large orange tarp, while I walked the perimeter, doing one final sweep of the area before we were picked up. That's when I saw them. Not 30 meters from where we were standing, behind a low berm of driftwood, tucked beneath a bent spruce, I found cougar tracks. Fresh ones, clear as anything. I could see the pad impressions and claw marks, spaced in a way that told me it had been walking, not running. It had circled behind our sight, backtracked us. It had been close in the night, watching. My mouth went dry. I crouched and took a couple of photos for the rangers, then stood up and looked around. Nothing. No movement. No sound except the tide pulling on the rocks. I walked fast back to the group and didn't say anything until we were packed and ready. The plane landed cleanly just after 11 a.m. We loaded up quick, and I felt a deep, quiet relief once we were in the air and looking down on the forest and waves. As we banked out over the cove, I saw a helicopter dropping into the clearing where we'd first seen the cat. A couple of rangers in orange jackets stepped out with dogs. They'd come to track it. I don't know what happened to the cougar, whether they tranquilized it or had to put it down, but I knew something was wrong with it. I've been in those woods too long not to feel when something's off. The girls went home with a wild story. Most of them thought it was cool, even exciting. A few didn't say much. I didn't push them. Not everyone processes those things the same way. But for me, that trip left a mark. It reminded me that no matter how much experience I have, how much gear we bring, or how cautious we are, the wild has its own rules. It doesn't need to explain itself. And that's what sticks with me most. Not the danger exactly, but the unpredictability. The cougar didn't attack. It didn't even show itself again. But it watched us, followed us. It moved through our camp while we slept, just out of reach. That quiet, creeping presence. That's what keeps me up some nights. And I'll tell you this, I've guided dozens of trips since then, but I've never taken another group through that stretch of coast again. We'd been planning the trip for a few weeks, just something simple to get away from the heat and the chaos of the city. I'd been swamped with work, my girlfriend Riley had been slammed too, and the idea of an unplugged weekend in the woods felt like the only kind of reset we could get that summer. We picked a spot up near Bear Ridge Lake, not far from Truckee, on the Nevada side. It was the 4th of July weekend, 2011. Hot as hell during the day, but up in the trees it was at least tolerable. Nights were chilly, stars so clear it felt like we were looking at space without a filter. We were camped at a dispersed site we found on a forestry map, a little off a dirt road called Granite Hollow. The site had a fire ring made out of rocks, a flat enough spot for our two-person tent, and a narrow game trail that disappeared into the trees. No bathrooms, no other real amenities. It wasn't even marked, just public land. The good kind of wild. We'd gotten there early Friday afternoon. I remember the way the light filtered through the pines as we set up, golden and soft. We set up the tent, unrolled the sleeping pads, sorted out our gear. Felt good. Clean air, dogs snuffling around, Riley humming to herself while hammering in a stake. Simple moments that stick with you more than you'd expect. The nearest visible site was about 100 yards to the east, through a thick patch of lodgepole pine and some boulders. Couldn't see it unless you stood at the right angle near a dip in the ridge, but you could hear it if people were loud enough. That evening, I heard voices over there. 2 different sets, I noticed. One of them sounded like a younger couple, Americans, maybe in their mid-20s. Loud, laughing, maybe a little buzzed. The other sounded like a family, thicker accents, maybe Eastern European. Kids' voices too, higher pitched and fast. And a woman who kept saying someone's name over and over again, kind of nagging but in a warm way. I couldn't make out much, but it seemed like they were 2 separate groups sharing the spot. Weird dynamic, but not unheard of in free camping zones. We kept to ourselves. Riley didn't like making small talk with strangers, and I wasn't eager to either. We had the dogs. Milo, a lanky mutt, and Daisy, a rescue with more bark than brains. We cooked over a little propane stove, played cards, listened to the wind, let the silence stretch out. It felt good to breathe air without exhaust in it. That first night, we slept like rocks. The second day, we hiked a bit around the ridgeline that curved around the lake. swam in the shallows where the water was barely above freezing, and napped under a tarp strung up between two trees. 4th of July itself was quiet from our end. No fireworks way out there, just the occasional thump of something far off. Could have been a gunshot, could have been a firework. Out there, it's hard to tell. Then that night hit. July 4th, 2011. We'd gone to bed a little before midnight. It had been dead quiet for the last few hours. Just the sounds of bugs, the occasional owl hooting in the distance. I remember drifting off with the nylon of the tent flapping just a bit in the wind. Riley curled up next to me, both dogs pressed into the bottom corners of the sleeping bag like heat-seeking missiles. At around 1 a.m., something snapped me awake. Not a sound at first, just a gut feeling. You know that jolt you get when your subconscious picks up on something before your conscious mind catches up? It was that. I opened my eyes, listened. Then I heard it shouting. It wasn't close, not right on us, but it wasn't far either. East of us, just over that patch of trees. The other site. The voices were sharp, cutting through the night. A man yelling, fast and aggressive. Another voice yelling back. Slower, more deliberate with an accent. Not English first language. Then a woman shouting over them both. She sounded panicked. Then a kid started crying. You ever hear a kid cry in the middle of the woods at night? Tightens your whole chest. Something primal in it. Riley stirred. She whispered, "What is that?" I held a hand out, told her to be quiet. I was straining to hear. You don't want to move too fast when you don't understand what you're hearing. You listen first. You take it in. From what I could piece together over the next few minutes, there had been some kind of argument between the two men. I couldn't make out all the words, but I caught enough. Something about respect, something about space, someone calling the other a psycho. Then someone screamed something like, "Get back!" and everything erupted. There was a crash, like someone knocked over a camp chair or kicked a cooler. Then the unmistakable sound of someone running, heavy footfalls through underbrush, cracking twigs. Then yelling again, wild now. Then silence. It held for maybe 30 seconds. Long enough that I started to think maybe it was over, maybe someone stormed off. And then came the sound of gunfire. 12 shots, maybe more. Rapid at first, then slower. Pop, pop, pop. Then one. Pause. Another. Then nothing. And the woods swallowed it all back up like nothing had happened. I dropped down flat in the tent. Riley was already curled tight into herself, eyes wide. Milo started to whine, and Daisy gave this half growl, half yelp sound that told me she was on the edge of losing it. I clamped a hand over Milo's snout, whispered H, like it was a prayer. All I could think about was stray bullets. I didn't know where they were aiming, or if they'd seen us, or if they thought we were involved somehow. We were invisible in the dark, but dogs barking would give us away instantly. I stayed there, laying still, breathing as quietly as I could, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might vibrate through my ribs. The dogs squirmed. Riley held on to me like we were about to be swept away. Then, footsteps, heavy ones, crunching over gravel and sticks, not far off. 2 male voices, the guy with the accent and the American one. No more yelling now, just tense, low voices. I couldn't catch every word, but I got the tone. Something had flipped. It was controlled but furious. The American guy kept saying something that sounded like, "Just give it back," over and over. Then the foreign guy snapped, his voice sharp and final, followed by the sound of someone getting pushed. Another scuffle. Then a sound like something metal hitting the ground, hard. Not a shot this time. Different. Like a tool or a weapon hitting rock. A pause. Then, fast footsteps. Another smack. Meaty, dull. A grunt. Then someone hit the dirt. Dead silence. 5 seconds. 10. Then I heard a woman sobbing. Then the rumble of a car engine turning over. Tires spun, gravel sprayed, and the vehicle sped off, disappearing down the dirt road leading back toward the highway. I didn't move. Riley didn't either. We waited there, dead quiet, for over an hour, just listening. Every tiny noise felt like a threat. The wind, a twig snapping in the distance, something rustling the brush. It all felt dangerous. Eventually, The adrenaline started to drain. I looked at the clock on my phone. It was after 3 a.m. Still dark, but getting close to first light. I whispered to Riley, asked if she was okay. She nodded, but she didn't speak. The dogs had calmed down, though Daisy was still tense. Milo just looked confused. Couldn't blame him. We didn't sleep. The sun came up around 5:45. The light through the trees was pale and washed out, everything looking too soft, too quiet after what had happened. We broke camp fast. Didn't make breakfast, didn't talk. We just packed, rolled up the tent, shoved the dogs in the back of the Subaru, and got the hell out. On the way down the road, we passed the other site. From the angle of the bend, I could see part of it clearly for the first time. Camp chairs overturned. A cooler split open. A blue tarp halfway unrolled, and what looked like a machete stuck into the dirt near the fire ring. No one was there. No cars. No voices. Just quiet. We hit the highway, didn't stop till we got to a gas station near the outskirts of Reno. Bought coffee and sat in the parking lot. Neither of us spoke for a while. It was too much to process. Too out of nowhere. We didn't call the cops. Maybe we should have. But in the moment, it felt safer to just disappear. We didn't know who had the gun, whether they were still out there, whether they'd seen our plates or followed our tracks. I looked up news reports for days afterward. Nothing. Not a mention. Either nobody reported it or it got buried. Riley never wanted to go back there. I didn't blame her. But here's the thing, and I know how this sounds, but even now, with all that, I still remember how beautiful that place was. The lake, the quiet, the trees. It's just that now, when I think about it, I don't hear the wind in the branches or the water lapping the shore. I hear gunshots, and I remember laying in that tent, praying my dogs wouldn't bark. Back in early October of 2022, my buddy Nathan and I drove up from southeastern Pennsylvania to upstate New York to hike the Cedar Brook 50, a 50-mile loop trail through dense forest, old logging roads, and quiet pine-covered hills in the northern Adirondacks. Nathan and I had been hiking together for years, weekend trails, longer multi-day hikes, and a few overnight winter trips. Nothing extreme, just two guys in their early 30s trying to stay connected to something outside work and city life. We'd planned this hike months in advance, marked the maps, packed carefully, and picked early fall because we figured the bugs would be gone and the foliage would be worth the extra weight of carrying warmer gear. We left that Friday morning around 6, aiming to start hiking by early afternoon. But between construction delays on I-81, a bad accident near Binghamton, and a detour through some small towns we hadn't planned for, we didn't make it to the Cedar Brook trailhead until almost 5 p.m. That pushed our whole timeline back, but we figured we'd still make it to the first site before dark. It wasn't that far in, maybe 2 miles, and we both had headlamps. The sun was already brushing the tops of the trees when we shouldered our packs and started down the trail. The first stretch of the trail was peaceful, quiet. The forest was wide and thick. Old trees, mostly pines and maples, with a deep carpet of dry leaves underfoot. The trail itself was well-worn but narrow in places, and once we crossed the first small ridge, we didn't see another soul. No houses, no road noise, no planes overhead. Just the sound of our boots on the dirt and the occasional squirrel rustling through leaves. About an hour in, with the last light fading fast, we reached the stream where the first designated camp was. A wide, rocky creek. More like a small river, really, cut through the trees and made a sharp bend where someone had cleared out a flat spot for tents just 20 feet off the trail. That was our stop for the night. We didn't waste time. Nathan pitched his small one-man tent near a thick cluster of firs. I strung up my hammock between 2 sturdy trees with my rainfly stretched tight overhead. The air was cool and getting colder quickly, probably mid-40s by then, so we layered up, got our little camp stove going, and made a quick meal of dehydrated pasta with bits of summer sausage tossed in. After that, we got a small fire going, not much more than a pile of glowing coals and a couple crackling sticks, just enough to warm our hands. Neither of us were in the mood to stay up. It had been a long day, and the silence out there, mixed with the sound of the stream rushing nearby, had a way of settling us down. We turned in probably a little after 8 p.m. I climbed into my hammock, wrapped myself up in my down quilt, and listened to the water and the occasional snap of a twig from the woods. There were no stars that night, too much cloud cover, and the trees blocked most of what little moonlight there was. Even with my eyes adjusted, it was pitch black out there, the kind of black where you can't see your hand in front of your face. It felt like I had only just started to doze off when I heard Nathan's voice calling my name. Not panicked, but definitely alert. "Hey Steve, you awake?" I stirred and pulled my quilt back. "Yeah," I said, my voice hoarse. "What's up?" "I keep hearing something," he said, "like something big moving around. Might be a bear." I stayed quiet a second, listening. All I could hear was the creak, constant and loud. I cleared my throat and called out a loud "hey" into the dark, hoping it might scare off whatever it was if anything was there. We always packed bear bags and strung them up well off the ground, away from camp, so I wasn't too concerned, but still, I didn't want some black bear poking around in the dark. Things went quiet again. I zipped my hammock closed and tried to fall back asleep. Maybe 10 minutes later, I heard Nathan again, a little louder this time. "Steve, you hearing that?" I sat up this time. The air was cold on my face, probably dropped into the 30s now. I unzipped the hammock and stepped out in my base layers, pulled on my fleece and boots, and grabbed my flashlight. Nathan was already out of his tent, standing in the dark with his headlamp on. He looked wired, eyes darting around. We both stood there for a moment, listening. At first, all I heard was the stream again, but then faint, something like a soft crunch. Leaves, slow, deliberate, not a rabbit, not wind. I flicked on my flashlight and scanned around the trees. Nothing. I swept the beam across the trail, then up and down the slope behind our camp. Still nothing. That's when we noticed it. A strange white light up the trail. Not bright, not flickering like a fire, more like a glow. It was maybe 200 or 300 feet away, right where the trail curved around a bend and disappeared into the trees. It didn't make sense. We hadn't seen another car in the lot. We hadn't passed a single person all day. And even if someone had started after us, they'd have no reason to hike this late and set up that far from the designated camp. We walked up to the trail to get a better look. The air felt even colder there, exposed above the stream bed. The wind had picked up, sending dry leaves skittering across the trail. I turned off my light, thinking it might make it easier to see the source of the glow. That's when it started to move. The light, whatever it was, began to shift, bobbing slightly, like someone stumbling down the trail. No sound, no crunch of leaves, just the motion of the light getting closer in a slow, unnatural pattern. Not smooth like a person walking, more like a weird, swaying lurch. We exchanged a look. Both of us were wide-eyed now. My stomach felt tight, like it does when something's about to go wrong. I turned my flashlight back on and pointed it straight at the light. It froze. Just like that, it stopped moving. Didn't dim, didn't blink, just stopped. I turned the light off again. The glowing figure, whatever it was, started toward us again. That's when I felt the fear really hit. Not panic, but that deep, cold fear that makes your jaw clench and your breath slow down. My heart was pounding. We both started yelling, trying to scare off whatever it was. Shouting, "Who's there? We're armed." Empty threats mostly, but loud enough to echo through the trees. Nothing. No reply. The light just kept doing that same strange movement. Advancing slowly when our lights were off, stopping when we turned them on. We backed off, fast walked back to our camp, grabbed our knives from our packs, and Nathan went digging through his bag to put his contacts in. I stayed by the trail, watching the bend where the light had been. The wind had died down now, and the woods went dead quiet. Not a single rustle, not even the usual creaks of branches. Just the steady hum of the stream and our breathing. Nathan reappeared a minute later. "Ready," he said. We moved slowly up the trail again, knives in hand, my flashlight beam sweeping the path. We rounded the bend, and there it was. Nothing. No glowing figure. No fire. No person. Just the trail stretching ahead, bending again around a thicker patch of trees. And up above the trees, between the bare branches, clear as day, hung the full moon. Huge and low in the sky, bright enough to throw light across the leaves and make everything shimmer. We stood there in silence. That was it. The light, the motion, all of it. It had been the moon. With the wind moving the branches and the trees swaying, it had looked like the light was moving. When we turned off our flashlights, our eyes adjusted just enough to catch the shimmer between the branches, and it gave the illusion of a shape coming toward us. Add in the stress of being out there in the cold, half asleep, our bodies still keyed up from the drive and the hike. We saw what we expected to see. We both laughed a little. The kind of nervous, stupid laugh you let out when the fear breaks and you feel like an idiot but also relieved. We stood there for another few minutes, just breathing in the cold air and watching the moonlight filter through the trees. I can't explain how real it had felt, how certain I was that someone or something was walking toward us, but it wasn't. It was just the moon, just the wind. Back at camp, we didn't bother trying to go back to sleep for a while. We made some tea on the stove, sat on a log, and didn't say much. Eventually, the fire died out and the cold started to settle in again. We crawled back into our shelters and actually managed to sleep the rest of the night without incident. The next morning, with the sun coming up and everything covered in frost, it felt like that whole thing had happened to someone else. We packed up, hit the trail again, and didn't talk much about it for the rest of the trip. The other nights passed quietly. No lights, no noises, just the steady rhythm of hiking and resting, eating and sleeping. But that first night stuck with me, not because something supernatural happened, because it didn't, because it was a perfect example of how quickly your brain can play tricks on you when you're tired, cold, and far from home. How fear doesn't need much to get a grip on you, just some shadows, a little light, the wind through the trees. That's all it takes. And out there, in the dark, your mind fills in the rest. Back in the summer of 2012, I was 32, and I'd taken some time off work to do a solo trip through the Dakotas. No grand plans, just me, my truck, my tent, and a few stops plotted on a crumpled map tucked into the glove compartment. One of those pins was for a campground in the North Unit of Theodore Roosevelt National Park in North Dakota. It wasn't a place many of my friends had heard of, which was kind of the point. I'd read it was quiet, out of the way, and that it got just enough foot traffic to avoid feeling completely forgotten. That sounded perfect to me. It was the second week of June. The drive into the park was exactly what I'd hoped for. Empty roads winding through a rugged, grassland meets badlands landscape. The kind of place where you can see for miles and still feel like you're boxed in by the land itself. The sky was doing that thing where it feels 100 stories tall. Big white clouds roamed lazily overhead, casting slow-moving shadows across the hills and valleys. I was already winding down mentally, letting the rhythm of the tires on gravel roads pull the last few threads of stress from my shoulders. The campground itself, Juniper Campground, was built to hold maybe 30 or so sites, though they weren't numbered like your typical state park setup. Just gravel pullouts, picnic tables, and metal fire rings tucked beneath the cottonwoods and box elders. There were some vault toilets and a spigot or two, but otherwise it was pretty bare bones. My kind of place. When I pulled in that afternoon, there wasn't a single other soul around. No other cars, no tents, nothing. Just me and the wind. And boy, was it windy. Not just breezy, but full-on gusts that came whipping down from the buttes and across the open ground like the earth itself was exhaling. Dust swirled, and the branches overhead groaned and snapped like old bones. I almost considered moving on, maybe trying to find shelter deeper into the hills, but I'd already driven 6 hours that day, and I was stubborn. I picked a site near the edge, away from the main loop, with a half circle of scraggly brush behind me and a decent view of the river valley below. Normally, I'd just stake out the four corners of my tent and call it good. But the wind was insistent, pushing and pulling like invisible hands trying to lift the nylon into the air. So I broke out the guy lines and secured every one of them. Drove each stake in deep and checked every knot twice. It took longer than I wanted it to, and I was sweating by the time I finished, but I'll admit, I felt good knowing the thing was locked down tight. That little dome was my only shelter out here, and I wasn't taking chances. Dinner was simple, a camp stove meal, something freeze-dried and salty that tasted better under the open sky than it ever would indoors. I sat at the picnic table, squinting into the wind and watching the sun drag its orange light down across the cliffs. The wind had finally started to die by the time darkness rolled in, just the occasional gust brushing through the trees and rattling the dry leaves. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag and lay there for a while, listening to the silence. Silence like you don't get in towns or even most campgrounds. No conversations, no generators, no music. Just wind, the occasional creak of a tree branch, and the soft sighing of the plains breathing in the dark. I was raised in Wisconsin dairy country. My family had cows, and I helped with milking before school every morning from the time I was 9 until I left for college. There are some sounds you don't forget, like the low shuffle of hooves on dirt, the heavy exhale of a cow's breath, or the specific sound of a full-grown bovine taking a long piss onto dry ground. It's a splattering, rhythmic sound, very distinctive. You could drop me anywhere in the world, blindfolded, and if I heard that sound, I'd tell you what it was. So when I woke up in the middle of the night to that exact sound, it didn't even register as strange at first. I blinked, barely awake, thinking, cows up early. My head sank back into my pillow, ready to disappear again into sleep. Then it hit me. There are no cows here. I sat bolt upright. My body moved before my brain finished catching up. I didn't unzip the tent door, too loud. Instead, I turned and unzipped the side window, just enough to get a view of the outside. The moon was high and full, casting everything in a silver blue light that made the world look like it was covered in frost. And there, maybe 10 feet away, was a massive, shaggy shape. Not a cow, a buffalo, and not just one. As I squinted and let my eyes adjust, I realized they were everywhere. Dozens of them, a whole herd, at least 50, maybe more, moving slow and quiet, grazing, milling around my tent, brushing past the picnic table, noses to the ground, tails flicking absently. One of them, the big one I'd seen first, lifted its head and stared straight at me. I held my breath. Its eyes caught the moonlight like polished obsidian. I didn't move, didn't blink. Then it turned its head and walked on, slow and heavy, stepping around the fire pit like it had been there 1,000 times. I wanted to take a picture, desperately. The way the moonlight hit their backs, the sound of them breathing, the sheer surreal beauty of it. It felt like a dream, but I didn't dare. The noise of a zipper, the click of a camera, even the light from my phone screen, it could have startled one of them. If even one of them panicked, it could set the whole group off. And they were standing so close, some of them just feet from the guy lines holding my tent upright. One wrong step, one spooked animal, and I'd be under 1,000 pounds of stampede. So I sat there, still as I've ever been in my life, my heart thudding in my chest, my ears wide open. They weren't silent, but they were calm. A few grunted, the kind of low, chest-deep sound you feel more than hear. Some snorted, hooves scuffed at the gravel. Every now and then one of them would shake, a full-body rustle like a dog after a bath, sending dust flying off their fur. They grazed, wandered, leaned against trees, and there I was in the middle of it all, a flimsy tent wall between me and them. I stayed like that for maybe an hour, maybe 2. Time got slippery. My eyes stopped darting and started following. My breathing slowed. Eventually, I unzipped all the tent windows, one at a time, careful and slow, so I could see out from every side. It felt like I was inside a lantern with the world lit up around me. And somewhere in all that watching, the fear slipped away. I stopped thinking about getting trampled. I stopped worrying about the wind or the silence or how far away the nearest person was. I just watched. They were beautiful, massive, ancient-looking creatures. The kind of thing you don't just see, you feel. Thick shoulders, heavy heads, eyes that looked older than the land they were standing on. And quiet, so quiet. Even the young ones, darting through the legs of the bigger bulls, made barely a sound. They stayed for a long time, long enough that I stopped being surprised by them. They were just there, part of the night. I sat cross-legged in the middle of my tent, wrapped in a blanket, watching them through the mesh like I was inside a snow globe. And as I sat there, a song crept into my head. Not from a speaker or a phone, just something from the past, from late-night drives and old memories. Wish you were here. It wasn't even about a specific person, just everyone I cared about. My folks, back home in Wisconsin. My sister, who always wanted to travel but never got the chance. A couple of old friends I drifted from but still thought about. I wished they could see what I was seeing, not through a screen, really see it. Eventually, the herd started to drift. One by one, they wandered away, down toward the trees and the river. No rush, just a slow migration like the tide going out. I watched until the last one disappeared behind the brush. And then it was quiet again. Truly quiet. I lay back down, the tent still open to the night, and let the cool air wash over me. I didn't sleep right away, just lay there with my hands behind my head, staring up through the open mesh at the stars. I didn't check the time. I didn't reach for my phone. I just existed. And when sleep finally came, it came easy. No thoughts, no worries, just peace. In the morning, there was no sign they'd ever been there except for a few hoof prints in the dirt and some droppings near the tree line. The wind had calmed completely. The sun was just starting to peek over the horizon, warm and gold and clean. I brewed coffee on my little stove, packed up slow, and drove out of the park without seeing another person. But I took something with me, a memory so vivid, so grounding, that even now, years later, I can still close my eyes and smell the dry grass, feel the cold breath of the wind, and hear the soft shuffle of hooves outside my tent. No ghosts, no monsters, just the kind of night that reminds you you're alive. And that sometimes the best company is the kind that never says a word. Back in November of 2014, I went on a deer hunting trip with my buddy Jesse. We were both in our late 20s then, both raised in Kentucky but had made the drive up to southern Ohio for this trip. Our other friend, Drew, had invited us to his family's old hunting shack tucked away deep in the Wayne National Forest, not too far from a small, almost forgotten town called MacArthur. His family had owned a stretch of land there since the 60s, mostly woods, hilly terrain, and not a soul around for miles unless it was deer season. We'd been planning the trip for weeks. Jesse and I packed up my old Tacoma and left before dawn the day before, drove 5.5 hours through some sketchy weather, then spent the better part of that afternoon unloading gear, scouting out the area a bit and splitting some firewood for the stove inside the shack. The place was rustic as hell. No insulation, wood stove for heat, no plumbing, and just an old-school Coleman lantern for light unless you brought your own flashlight or headlamp. The outhouse had been knocked down by a storm years ago, and Drew had replaced it with what he called the throne, which was basically a 5-gallon bucket with a toilet seat duct taped on top. That night we had chili and beans for dinner, made in a cast iron pot over the wood stove. It was the kind of meal that tastes like heaven after a cold day outside. Hot, spicy, and filling. Jesse made fun of me for having thirds. I should have known better. We hit the bunks around 9:30 p.m. I slept on a wooden cot closest to the stove while Jesse snored away on a sleeping pad across from me. Drew had his own spot near the back wall. The wind picked up around midnight, and not long after that, snow started to fall. It was just light flurries. Nothing crazy, just enough to dust the treetops and turn the whole world white. Around 2 a.m., my stomach woke me up with a vengeance. That chili and the beans had done their work. I laid there for a minute hoping the urge would pass, but it wasn't going to happen. I knew I wasn't going to make it till morning. So, I slipped on my boots, threw on my jacket over the thermal shirt I'd slept in, grabbed a headlamp, the shit stool, and a half-used roll of toilet paper, and made my way outside. The air hit me like a slap, cold and wet and thick with that quiet kind of stillness you only get deep in the woods during snowfall. My breath fogged out in big clouds, and the light crunch of my boots in the fresh snow was the only sound around. I didn't want to be too close to the shack, mostly for the sake of dignity and keeping the smell away from camp, so I walked about 20 yards out, toward the tree line, where a little hollow dipped down slightly from the ridge. The moon was behind the clouds, and even with my headlamp, I couldn't see more than 10-15 feet ahead. Everything beyond that was swallowed in shadows. I set the bucket down, dropped my boxers around my ankles and sat. I figured I'd be out there 5 minutes max. Then I heard it. It started with a soft crack, like a twig snapping underfoot. I froze, trying to hold still, listening. A few seconds later, another snap, then the unmistakable sound of dry brush being pushed aside. The sound wasn't loud, but it was steady. Something was moving through the woods, and not far from where I was sitting, maybe 30 or 40 yards off. I killed the headlamp to try and get my night vision back, thinking maybe it was a deer. I sat there shivering, hunched over on that bucket in the pitch black, every muscle in my body tense as a bowstring. My heart thudded in my chest like a drum. My ears were straining, but the snow muffled everything. Then I heard the breathing. It was heavy, deep, slow inhales and loud, rattling exhales. I could almost feel it more than I could hear it, like the way you can sense someone exhaling behind you even if they don't make a sound. That's when the fear kicked in hard. I reached into the pocket of my jacket and wrapped my hand around my pistol. It was a 9mm Glock I carried for side protection when we were out in bear country, though I'd never actually had to use it before. My fingers felt like ice, but I gripped that thing like my life depended on it. Every time I heard a branch break or a crunch in the snow, I jerked my head in that direction, swinging my arm around to aim blind into the dark. My flashlight was back at the shack, and the headlamp I had was useless for range. It barely lit up anything beyond 10 feet. Couldn't see shit. I sat there, pants down, gun shaking in my hand, doing full 360-degree sweeps every time I heard a step. I wasn't sure if I was being stalked or if I just interrupted something passing through, but the fear had my gut twisted worse than the beans ever could. Minutes dragged on, though it felt like hours. I kept waiting for something to lunge out of the dark. My nerves were on fire. My mind was running every kind of worst-case scenario I could think of. Bear, mountain lion, maybe even a human, but that breathing told me all I needed to know. It was something big. Not a coyote, not a deer. Too heavy, too close, and suddenly I didn't need to go anymore. I yanked my boxers back up, nearly fell over trying to stand, grabbed the bucket under one arm and the toilet paper under the other, and stumbled back toward the shack. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. Back inside, the warmth hit me, but it didn't settle my nerves. I shut the door quietly, didn't say a word to Jesse or Drew, just got into my sleeping bag fully clothed with the Glock resting beside me. I didn't sleep much, if at all. The next morning, around 6:30, we all got up. I played it cool, didn't mention anything right away, just made some coffee on the little propane stove and waited for the sun to come up enough to take a look outside. Jesse stepped out first, bundled up, headed to check the trail cams. I followed a few minutes later, back to the spot where I'd been the night before. And there they were, clear as day in the fresh snow, bear tracks. Big ones. Looked like it had been walking in a wide circle around the spot I'd been squatting, almost like it had been curious or trying to figure out what I was. There were at least a dozen prints, some coming as close as 10 feet from where I'd been sitting. It hadn't come in charging or huffing, but it had definitely been there, and it had definitely known I was there. I just stood there for a while, staring at those tracks with the sun creeping over the ridge, casting long shadows across the snow. My breath came out slow and steady now, not from panic, but from that cold realization that I'd been inches away from something that could have ended me without even trying. I told Jesse and Drew after we got back from the morning hunt. They both laughed at first, thought I was exaggerating. But when they saw the tracks, and I showed them the spot and the bucket sitting there like a trophy in the middle of that circle, the mood changed. Nobody said much after that. Drew just nodded slowly and muttered something about how bears had been getting bolder that season. We kept our pistols a little closer the next few days, kept the food sealed tighter, and I never took a shit outside without someone standing watch again. The trip ended without incident, but that night stuck with me. It wasn't the kind of story I told at bars or around campfires unless I really trusted the people listening. It's not a hero story. I didn't fight off a bear or survive an attack. But I sat, half naked, in the woods, completely vulnerable, with a predator walking circles around me in the dark. And I didn't even know it until later. It reminded me how wild the woods really are, how small we are in them, and how fast things can turn from funny to terrifying without a single sound. I've been camping out at Oak Hollow Nature Reserve for about 12 years now. It's a tucked-away patch of forestland in southern Missouri, about 40 minutes from the nearest town that's mostly a gas station, a Dollar General, and a church. There's a festival that happens every May, right when the weather starts getting warm but before the bugs get really bad. Used to be a mellow gathering. Music, bonfires, a little too much weed, and a lot of barefoot people wandering around talking about energy and chakras. The kind of crowd that made you feel like you were stepping out of the real world for a few days. That was back when there were maybe a couple hundred of us total, tops. But things change. Word got out. Somehow, the festival started getting noticed by folks from the nearby towns. The kind of people who normally wouldn't set foot near a bunch of barefoot, patchouli-drenched hippies. I'm talking about the camo-wearing, lifted truck-driving crowd. Somewhere along the way, the festival shifted in reputation from peaceful hippie retreat to free-for-all party in the woods. The people who started showing up didn't care about meditation or folk music. They came to drink, get high on whatever they could get their hands on, and tear the place up. Last year, 2024, the main May festival hit about 500 people. The old-timers barely recognized it anymore. Some folks stopped coming altogether. I kept going mostly out of habit, and because even though things had changed, there were still good people around. But I also started volunteering for security. Not real security. None of us are licensed or trained or anything like that. It's more like keep an eye out duty in exchange for getting in free. That year, they needed extra help for the overnight shifts, so I signed up. I remember the night all too well. It was a Friday, early May. The festival was in full swing, and the place was packed. Tents and campers were sprawled across the meadows and trails like a second layer of landscape. Music was thumping from the main stage, and several bonfires were already going strong across the site. You could smell wood smoke, sweat, and cheap beer on the breeze. My shift started at 10 p.m. and went until 6 a.m. I'd pulled night duty before. Usually it was boring. The worst you'd see was someone too drunk to find their tent or the occasional couple arguing after too much tequila. I was posted near the North Fire Circle, a spot tucked between a patch of old oaks and a wide, open meadow. It was one of the biggest gathering spots after dark. I had a radio clipped to my belt and a flashlight that barely worked, plus a dull walkie-talkie. My partner that night was Drew, someone I'd known for years. We weren't close, but we'd seen each other enough at these events to recognize each other's faces. Maybe shared a beer or two in years past. He was in his early 30s, beard down to his collarbone. Always wore the same faded army jacket no matter the weather. It was around midnight when things started to go sideways. A group of newcomers, definitely not regulars, rolled up to the fire circle. Loud, stumbling drunk, shouting over each other. You could smell the whiskey on them 10 feet away. One of them stood out. Tall guy, late 20s maybe. Ball cap on backwards, flannel shirt with the sleeves cut off, jeans tucked into mud-covered boots. You could tell right away he was already gone. Eyes glassy, jaw tight, pacing back and forth like a caged dog. He wasn't talking to anyone, just muttering under his breath, taking long swigs from a silver flask. He had a girl with him, blonde, maybe 5'2", jean shorts and a bikini top. She was high on something else, moving with that loose, dreamy sway that's all too common at these things. At one point, she walked up to the fire, took off her top, and started dancing. That happens out here. Nobody thinks twice. It's part of the culture, body freedom and all that. But this guy, he snapped. I saw it happen from maybe 20 feet away. He was standing off to the side, eyes locked on her, and then he just exploded. Came charging into the circle, knocking over a camping chair, screaming about how she was disrespecting him. His voice was thick, slurred, almost unintelligible, but the rage in him, it cut through everything. A few people tried to calm him down. One guy stepped in, hands up, saying something about how it wasn't a big deal. That's when he swung. First punch knocked the guy to the dirt. It turned fast from shouting to a full-on brawl. Drew and I rushed in, trying to separate people. I remember grabbing the drunk guy by the shoulders, yelling at him to back off and getting shoved hard in the chest for my trouble. That's when I realized he was sweating like crazy. His whole face was flushed deep red, veins bulging in his neck. He wasn't just drunk. He was on something else too. Meth maybe, or bath salts. I don't know. Drew got hold of him from behind, tried to restrain his arms, and that's when it happened. Quick, slick motion. The guy reached into his front jeans pocket and came out with a knife. Small, maybe a 3-inch blade, but sharp enough to do damage. He whipped it around and slashed at Drew's arm. It happened in a flash. Drew let out this guttural, shocked sound and stumbled back, clutching his forearm. Blood started pouring down, fast and heavy. I didn't think. I lunged at the guy and got him in a full Nelson. Arms locked under his pits, fingers laced behind his head. I squeezed tight and lifted, forcing his feet partially off the ground so he couldn't get leverage. He thrashed immediately, twisting, bucking, trying to stomp my feet, slam his head back into mine. I ducked low and kept my grip tight, adjusting every few seconds as he writhed like a damn animal. That hold lasted for 30 minutes. I'm not exaggerating. 30 minutes. I know because I checked my watch afterward. And in that time, I had to keep a wild, high, and furious man locked in place while also shouting for someone to get the cops. Shouting for someone to help Drew, watching him kneeling by the fire trying to tie a belt around his bicep, face white as chalk. I kept thinking Drew was going to pass out, or bleed out, or both. He was trying to stay upright, holding the belt with one hand while blood dripped from his fingertips onto the dirt. The guy in my grip never stopped struggling. Not once. He cursed, spit, thrashed his legs, twisted like he had no bones. My arms were screaming after 10 minutes. My shoulders started locking up around 15. At 20, my fingers were cramping so bad I couldn't feel the tips. He was sweating all over me, his hat had fallen off, and his back was slick. I was terrified I'd lose my grip. I kept digging my heels into the ground, bracing, adjusting. Just sheer adrenaline and stubbornness keeping me upright. Someone finally ran over to say the cops were on their way. Someone else had called 911 and flagged them down near the main road. Oak Hollow is a good 15-minute drive from any real emergency service. Even with sirens blaring, it took another 10 to 15 minutes before they arrived. Those last minutes felt like a lifetime. Drew was barely holding on. Someone knelt beside him trying to keep pressure on the wound. A couple people had started crowding around, whispering, filming with their phones like it was a show. I was still locked in with the guy, arms numb, drenched in sweat, praying he didn't have another weapon. He was snarling by then, eyes wild, face twitching, completely gone. When the first cop car pulled up, I nearly cried with relief. 2 officers jumped out, guns drawn, shouting. I didn't let go until they were physically pulling him from my arms. He kept fighting even as they slammed him to the ground and cuffed him. It took both cops to hold him down. An ambulance rolled in a couple minutes later. Paramedics rushed to Drew and got to work on his arm. I stepped back, hands trembling, heart pounding, and nearly collapsed onto the grass. Someone handed me a bottle of water. I chugged half of it without thinking. Drew ended up okay. He needed stitches, and they said the knife had missed anything vital by about half an inch. Close call. Too close. The guy who attacked him, he was arrested on the spot, aggravated assault, possession of a weapon, resisting arrest, and a few other charges. Word was he'd taken a cocktail of alcohol, Molly, and something else nobody could quite pin down. Whatever it was, it turned him into a nightmare. The organizers banned him for life. Not that it means much, there's no rail gate, no IDs. But they spread the word fast. Posted his face on the bulletin board. Said if anyone saw him again, to alert security and call the sheriff. I never saw him again. I hope I never do. After that night, things felt different for me. I'd already been growing uneasy with how the festival was changing, how the old vibe was being drowned out by drunken chaos. But that incident cemented it. The sanctuary wasn't what it used to be. Too many people, too little control, too many bad actors slipping through. I didn't feel safe there anymore. Not really. I still go out to Oak Hollow now and then, but not during the festival. Not anymore. I go in the off-season when it's quiet. Just a couple close friends, maybe a dog, a fire, and the sounds of the woods. I miss what it used to be. A lot of us do. We talk about starting something smaller, somewhere else, maybe. This happened in the spring of 1999. I was 12 years old and had been in Scouts for about a year and a half at that point. Our troop, Troop 168 from a little town near Bakersfield, had planned a 3-night camping trip in the Mojave Desert, specifically to a spot just outside the boundaries of Mojave National Preserve, in a designated camping area surrounded by nothing but wide-open desert, dry brush, and a scattering of boulders that looked like God had thrown them down from the sky a million years ago and left them to cook in the sun. There were about 16 of us in the troop on that trip, not including the adult leaders. Most of the guys were between 10 and 15 years old, with a few older teens acting as junior leaders. Mr. Darby, the scoutmaster, was a high school chemistry teacher who knew his stuff. Mr. Reiner was the assistant leader, a retired cop who always had a knife on his belt and a cup of instant coffee in his hand. They were solid guys, responsible and sharp. We arrived late Friday afternoon. The heat was still brutal even though it was supposed to be spring. No shade, just that pale, almost white sun beating down on everything. The ground was baked sand and crushed gravel, hard enough to sting your palms if you tripped. There weren't any real trees, just creosote bushes, the occasional mesquite, and the famous Joshua trees that stood like surreal sentinels with twisted arms reaching in every direction. The rocks were enormous, some the size of garages, stacked together in weird formations like nature's version of Jenga, the kind of place that feels ancient, heavy, and silent in a way you don't get in the woods. I was sharing a tent with my friend Brandon. He was a little taller than me, with a sharp sense of humor and a tendency to act tougher than he was. We thought we were being clever, maybe even a little badass, by setting our tent farther away from the rest of the troop. Everyone else pitched close to the main fire pit, maybe 10 or 15 feet apart. But Brandon and I hauled our stuff over to a flattish spot near a large boulder, maybe 100-150 feet from the main group. We told ourselves it would be quieter out there, less annoying. In truth, we just thought it'd make us look cool, like we weren't scared of being a little separate from the pack. We set up our little dome tent, got our sleeping pads and bags unrolled, and stashed our gear. That first night was chill. We had the usual scout dinner, foil packets filled with hamburger, potatoes, onions, and sat around the campfire afterward telling dumb stories, roasting marshmallows, and generally doing what boys do. At some point, Mr. Darby told us to head back to our tents and quiet down. Most of the guys drifted off without a fuss. Brandon and I stayed up for a bit, lying in our tent with the rain fly off, looking up through the mesh ceiling at the stars. Out there, with zero light pollution, the sky looked unreal. The Milky Way was a cloudy smear across the black, and satellites crept along in silent straight lines. Eventually, we stopped talking and tried to fall asleep. The desert cools off fast once the sun sets, and it got cold in a hurry. I remember tucking my arms into my sleeping bag and turning on my side, trying to ignore the little pebbles under my pad. For a while, it was silent, just the occasional breeze brushing over the tent, a distant cough or snore from the main camp, and the sound of Brandon shifting in his bag. Then, sometime well after midnight, we heard the footsteps. At first, it didn't register as anything weird, just a crunch of gravel. One step, then another, slow, deliberate, like someone walking up to our tent from the left side. Brandon and I both froze. I looked at him, and I could tell from the way his eyes were wide open in the dim starlight that he was hearing it too. Crunch, crunch, crunch. It wasn't the sound of a kid. These were heavy, adult heavy. The gravel out there wasn't soft. Any decent-sized rock underfoot made a sharp, clear sound when it was stepped on. The steps sounded like someone wearing boots. Not fast, not stomping, but definitely not trying to be stealthy either. We didn't say anything. We just listened. The steps stopped maybe 5 or 6 feet from our tent. Close, too close. I remember thinking it had to be Mr. Darby messing with us. Maybe he saw how far we'd pitched our tent and thought he'd teach us a lesson. Or maybe one of the older kids. But then we heard voices from the campfire. Mr. Darby laughing about something. Mr. Reiner talking. Someone else coughing. Crunch, crunch. The steps moved again, this time around the back of the tent. Still slow, still heavy. I clenched the zipper of my sleeping bag and tried to calm my breathing. Brandon whispered, "Who is that?" I didn't answer. I didn't know. I wanted to unzip the door and peek outside, but every time I thought about it, I got this gut-deep fear. What if I opened it and saw someone just standing there, not saying anything? Then the steps stopped again. Total silence. No breeze. No voices from the camp anymore. Just dead silence. Then we heard someone call out, not close, down by the fire ring. It was Andrew, one of the older scouts, calling out for Mr. Darby to pass the lantern. That's when it hit me. Whoever was outside our tent, it wasn't anyone from the troop. Or if it was, they were running some kind of fast, silent prank that didn't make any sense. Then the footsteps started again, but not from where they stopped. This time they started from the other side of the tent. No sound of them walking away from their previous spot. Just silence. Then suddenly crunches from another direction. That made my skin crawl. I remember feeling cold in a way that had nothing to do with the night air. Brandon and I started calling out names. Not loudly, but enough that if someone was outside, they'd hear us. Mr. Darby? Nothing. Andrew? Nothing. From the campfire area, someone responded. Yeah, but it wasn't close. It was far. Way too far for someone to have walked from our tent to the fire in time to answer. Now we were really freaking out. I whispered, "You think it's someone from another group?" Brandon didn't answer. His jaw was clenched, and he was just staring at the ceiling of the tent like it might give him answers. Eventually, we called out to Brandon's older brother, Kyle, who was also on the trip. He answered from down at the fire, and we begged him to come check on us. After some back and forth, he finally walked over, flashlight in hand. We watched the light bobbing across the sand and felt a wave of relief. He unzipped the tent and looked in, annoyed. "What's the deal?" We told him. All of it. He listened, then stepped out and did a slow walk around the tent. Nothing. He looked behind the big boulder nearby. Still nothing. But then, just as he was about to head back down, we heard it again. Footsteps. Not as loud this time. Lighter, like someone barefoot or wearing soft shoes. Coming from behind the tent. Slow, deliberate. Kyle froze. He crouched down and waited. The steps got closer. Then, like flipping a switch, he yanked open the flap and popped his head out. The flashlight beam whipped back and forth. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. He did that 3 more times over the next 20 minutes. Waited until the sound got close, then popped out. Every time, the same result. Nobody there. No places to hide. The nearest cover was a sparse cluster of low Joshua trees and a small rock pile maybe 40 feet off. Even those didn't offer enough concealment for a full-grown person to vanish into. And no way anyone could have sprinted off silently. Eventually, Kyle gave up and said it had to be some kind of animal. Maybe a fox or a bobcat. I didn't say anything, but I'd seen bobcats before. They don't walk like that, and they're quiet. Whatever this was, it was two-legged and heavy, at least at first. Kyle went back to his tent. Brandon and I stayed up a while longer. The heavier footsteps never came back, but the lighter ones did, on and off for about an hour. Always just outside the tent, always slow, always disappearing when we so much as moved. Eventually, we both passed out from sheer exhaustion. The next morning, we got up before anyone else and looked around. The sand around our tent was a mess. Our own tracks, some scuff marks from the setup. Nothing obvious. No clear footprints. Just disturbed gravel that could have been anything. We asked around all morning. No one owned up to anything. Nobody heard footsteps. Nobody came near our tent. It never happened again. Not that night or the next one. We slept with our flashlights clutched in our hands, and both of us were jumpy, but it was quiet after that. Nothing but wind and bugs. We never figured out what it was. Could have been some kid from another camp, but we didn't see any other groups out there all weekend. Could have been some hiker or weirdo messing with us. But why? Why our tent, and why so careful not to be seen? We talked about it for a while afterward, and eventually just stopped. Not because we didn't care, but because it made our skin crawl every time we remembered it. It didn't feel like a prank. It felt calculated. Like whoever it was, they knew how to move without being seen, knew when to stop, when to start again. Maybe it was just some loner having fun at our expense. Maybe it was a coincidence, a trick of sound. I'll never forget the trip we took to the White Mountains in the summer of 2022. We live in central Pennsylvania, and we'd been wanting to get away for a while. Somewhere with clean air, tall trees, and room for the kids to run around. My wife, Jen, and I had been talking about Franconia Notch in New Hampshire for months. We'd both been up that way in our 20s long before we had kids, and now that our 3 were finally old enough, ages 12, 9, and 7, it felt like the right time. We packed the car full. Food for a week, sleeping bags, the old canvas tent, clothes for every kind of weather, and everything else you could think of. We left early on a Saturday morning, before the sun was up. The drive took us over 13 hours with stops, but when we finally pulled into the campground, tucked between thick pine woods and boulders bigger than my minivan, I felt something settle in my chest. Like, yeah, this is it. This is where we need to be. The campground was just south of Franconia Notch State Park. Not one of those crowded, paved lot kind of places. This was rustic. Dirt pads, scattered fire pits, barely enough signal to check the weather. Just the way I like it. Our site was set back a little, with trees on all sides and a small hill behind us. Nothing fancy, but it felt private, and the kids immediately started running around while we set up the tent. That first day was easy. We walked a trail around a lake, let the kids splash their feet in the water, and grilled hot dogs at sunset. That night, all 5 of us were out cold before 9. Nothing but the sound of crickets and the wind moving through the branches. The second day, we hit a couple popular spots. We went to the basin, a deep, smooth pothole carved out by years of rushing water. It's one of those places that looks better in person than in pictures. The kids loved climbing over the rocks, watching the water swirl in that weird, hypnotic way. We ate lunch on a flat boulder by the river, just the 5 of us and the sound of water rushing past. We made it back to camp early enough to cook some burgers and get a fire going. Slept like babies again. The third day was when things started to get real. We decided to hike part of the Franconia Ridge Trail. It's a serious hike, long, steep, and rocky, but the views from the top are unbelievable. We started early and made a full day out of it. Jen and I carried most of the water and snacks in our packs, and the kids held up surprisingly well for most of it. The ridgeline gave us a 360-degree view of rolling green hills, distant blue peaks, and valleys stretched out like a painting. We spent a little too much time up top and ended up getting back to the campground just as the sky started turning that bluish gray you see before dark. By the time we'd eaten and cleaned the dishes, it was well past sunset. I was packing everything into the back of the SUV, coolers, food bins, anything with a scent. We're good about that kind of stuff. I've read the warnings about bears, but that night I learned just how close they can come. I was crouched by the car, tossing in a bag of snacks, when I felt something. You know how your brain registers something before you even understand what it is? Like a shift in the air, or a feeling that you're not alone. I turned my head to the left and saw him, a black bear, standing maybe 6 feet away from me. I froze, literally didn't move an inch. My heart didn't just skip a beat, it dropped right through my stomach. He wasn't a monster, not one of those massive Alaskan bears you see on TV, but he was big, maybe 250, 300 pounds. His fur was dark and shiny, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. His eyes locked onto me. We both just stood there. I could have reached out and touched his nose if I wanted to. It was that close. Jen and the kids were still by the fire, maybe 20 feet away. I didn't dare shout, didn't move toward them, didn't run. I had no idea what he would do if I moved fast. There was a pot sitting near my feet, leftover from cleaning up dinner. I reached down slow, real slow, and picked it up. My other hand grabbed the big metal spoon I'd used to stir the pasta. Without thinking, I stood up and banged that spoon against the pot as hard as I could. Asterisk clang. Asterisk. The bear flinched, took a step back. I hit it again, Asterisk clang clang clang. Asterisk. Right in his face. His ears went back. Then he turned and ran, crashing through the brush like a bulldozer. My hands were shaking, legs too. I backed up toward the fire, barely able to breathe. But before I could even open my mouth to tell Jen what happened, I heard twigs snap in the same direction. He came back. I don't know if he thought I was bluffing, or if the food smell was just too tempting. But there he was again, stepping out of the dark trees like nothing had happened. I wasn't thinking anymore. I just walked straight at him, banging the pot and shouting this time. He ran again, deeper into the woods. I didn't stop. I followed him, swinging the pot and spoon like a lunatic. I must have looked insane, but I didn't care. He finally vanished into the dark, and I didn't see him again after that. That night, I didn't sleep much. Every noise outside the tent made me sit up. Every scratch or breeze had me reaching for the flashlight. But nothing else came. By morning, it was like it never happened. The sun rose, birds chirped, kids woke up asking for pancakes. And honestly, if that had been the scariest part of the trip, I wouldn't even be telling this story. But the last night was something else entirely. We'd been in the mountains nearly a week by that point. The weather had been perfect. Warm, sunny days and cool nights. We were starting to feel the rhythm of camp life. Cooking meals together, playing card games by the lantern, walking to the river to rinse off. It was July 4th and that day was hot, probably in the 90s. The campground was buzzing. People hanging flags, cooking ribs and burgers, kids running around with water balloons. We spent the morning swimming in a lake, the afternoon hiking a short trail with a view, and that evening we drove into a nearby town for fireworks. It was a good show, small town stuff but beautiful. We got ice cream from a stand and sat on the grass together, watching the sky light up in reds and blues and golds. Back at camp, the night was thick and humid. Clouds were rolling in, but the forecast said maybe a passing shower. Nothing serious. We didn't think twice about it. Tucked the kids into their sleeping bags around 10. Jen and I laid there a while, talking, listening to the distant pop of leftover fireworks. Eventually, we drifted off. Then just before midnight, everything changed. I woke up to wind. Not just wind, a sound, a roar, like a train coming through the trees. I unzipped the tent door and poked my head out. The trees were thrashing, leaves swirling through the air. The rain hit seconds later, hard and fast, slamming against the tent walls like someone dumping buckets. Water started seeping in under the fly almost immediately. The wind kept shifting direction, and the tent was rocking. I grabbed a flashlight and shook my oldest son awake. We pulled on our boots and stepped out into the madness. The rain was coming sideways. My shirt was soaked through in seconds. I pulled the tarp from the back of the SUV and tried to drape it over the tent, but the wind caught it like a sail. My son and I fought it together, hands slipping on the wet nylon, finally managing to weigh it down with rocks and bungee cords. That's when I heard the crack. A branch, the size of a baseball bat, came spinning through the campsite, bouncing off a tree and skidding across the dirt. More branches followed, not little twigs, chunks of wood with weight. The wind screamed through the pines like it wanted to rip the whole forest down. I looked around and saw movement. Flashlights bouncing, people running to their cars, doors slamming, headlights cutting through the rain. One family backed their SUV out so fast they nearly clipped a tree. Their tent was still staked down, but only barely. The wind picked it up and threw it, twisting it into the trees like garbage. I thought about doing the same, packing the family into the car and getting out. But I couldn't bring myself to leave the gear. We were hours from home, and I couldn't afford to lose everything. We hunkered down. I sat by the door of the tent for the next 5 hours, holding the frame with both hands. The kids cried off and on. Jen lay still, whispering to them, calming them. I watched the shadows of trees bend until their tops nearly touched the ground. I kept thinking, one of them's gonna come down. Just one. And we're dead. That night felt like it lasted forever. By the time the sun started to rise, the wind had calmed to a steady breeze. The rain slowed to a drizzle. I stepped out and looked around. It was a war zone, branches everywhere, some the size of logs. A few smaller trees completely uprooted. One had fallen across the campground road. The tent next to us was gone. Nothing left but a cooler and a ripped rainfly flapping from a tree branch. I walked the loop. Power lines were down, snapped like twine. One site had a tree fall across the fire pit, crushing the picnic table. Miraculous. I was 10 years old the spring we got lost outside Cedar Mesa. I didn't know then how serious it was, how close things could have gone sideways. But I understood just enough to be scared, tired, and thirsty. It was supposed to be a 5-day backpacking trip, just me, my mom, and my stepdad, down into the winding sandstone corridors of a side canyon that joined Grand Gulch in southern Utah. It was early May of 2003, and the plan was to hike down, explore ruins, petroglyphs, and alcoves, loop around for a few days, and then hike out to a road where we'd stashed a mountain bike to ride back to our van. We weren't beginners, not even close. My stepdad, Paul, had spent decades backpacking in the Southwest. My mom was careful and well-prepared. And even though I was young, this wasn't my first trip either. The first few days were about as perfect as it gets out there. Clear skies, that kind of warm that feels just right, not scorching, not cold. We carried plenty of water but made use of the potholes and tanajas in the canyon, filtering from shaded pockets that still held water from the last storm. We saw nobody else after the first morning. Only lizards, birds, the occasional canyon wren echoing from above, and the silent company of ancient ruins tucked into cliffs. We were moving slow, stopping often to let me rest, and exploring side passages. On day 4, we made our way up a narrow tributary toward the rim, following what the topo map said was a climbable exit route. It was supposed to be a long day of hiking uphill, then a short camp on the mesa top, and then a final morning walking back to the bike and getting out. That's what we'd planned. But when we crested the rim and finally got up onto the open desert above, things didn't feel right. There wasn't a trail, there wasn't even a clear direction. Just open country with scattered juniper, pinyon, and sandstone ledges, with distant ridgelines and mesas all around us. The climb out had been much harder and slower than we thought, especially with low energy and packs that weren't light. When we looked back, the canyon we'd just come from disappeared into the desert like a scar that got lost in the skin. We realized then that the top wasn't where we expected to come out. We were way off. Paul pulled the map again, then the compass. There were no GPS devices, no inReach or emergency beacons. Just paper, steel, and memory. We hadn't seen a single person in days. He tried to orient us. We knew the general direction we had to head. The van was parked on a dirt road east of where we should have come up. We knew the road made a long bend and ended up skirting the rim somewhere to the northeast. That was all we had. We didn't want to waste more daylight. The sun was already lower than we liked, so we started walking. We had maybe 1.5 liters of water left between us. That was with every bottle counted. We'd brought extra, but we'd used it assuming we were nearly out. That's the thing about these desert canyons. Once you're out of them, there's no water until you hit civilization again or you're lucky enough to find a spring or a cattle tank. Neither of those were common in that part of the plateau. We walked for what felt like hours across low ridges and dry washes, trying to keep a bearing that aimed us generally east-northeast. At some point, the light dropped fast, and we knew we couldn't keep going safely in the dark. The last of the sunset burned orange across the rocks, and we hiked down into a small, shallow draw, then rolled out sleeping pads under a low pinyon pine. The air got cold fast. Dinner was 2 power bars split 3 ways. I remember trying not to chew too fast. I was starving, but I also knew it might be the last food we had until we got out. Nobody said much. My mom wrapped her arm around me as we lay there. Paul sat with the map again, headlamp turned low. I could tell he was frustrated, but not panicked. Still, the worry was heavy in the air. My mouth was dry as hell. I'd taken only a few sips that afternoon. I was trying to save the water, but even then, I could tell we didn't have enough. Not for the next day if we didn't find something soon. That night was one of the longest of my life. I barely slept. Every gust of wind felt colder than it should have. I woke up constantly to the sound of branches moving or my mom shifting beside me. And when the light finally came up over the mesa, my body was sore, my stomach was tight, and my mouth felt like sand. We started walking again at sunrise, still east. The land rolled in low rises and shallow dips, but it all looked the same. No landmarks stood out. Every time we thought we might be getting close to something recognizable, it turned out to be just another wash or false rise. There were no tire tracks, no signs of old roads, just open desert. I lagged behind sometimes. My legs were short, my pack was heavy, and every step felt like it took more effort than it should have. The sun came up hard. By mid-morning, it was blazing. We took short breaks in the shade of juniper trunks when we could, but shade was rare. We were down to maybe a few ounces of water total. My lips were cracking. I stopped sweating at some point. I didn't really understand what that meant, but Paul did. It was around late morning, maybe 10:30 or 11, when we finally spotted it. A faint 2-track road running diagonally through the desert. Barely visible, just twin ruts in the dirt, but real, man-made. Paul let out this low sound, almost a grunt of relief. I didn't say anything. I was too tired, but I felt something lift in my chest. The road meant we were somewhere. We weren't just wandering anymore. We followed it. The 2-track got clearer as we walked, the ruts more defined. Eventually, we were able to follow it without checking the compass every few minutes. Paul said the road probably connected to the one where the van was parked, just miles away now. And sure enough, by early afternoon, we reached a small cache. A pile of rocks with a cheap tarp draped over it, sheltering a beat-up mountain bike and a couple energy bars we'd stashed before the trip. That cache was like a godsend. Paul pulled the tarp off the bike, checked the tires, brakes, and chain. It all looked fine. He said he'd ride the remaining 8 miles or so to the van and drive it back. We were saved, I thought. It was almost over. I sat in the dirt while he rode off, tires crunching against dry gravel, his figure getting smaller and smaller down the road. Then the sky changed. It started with wind, gusts of warm air that kicked up dust and hit our faces with grit. Then darker clouds started stacking on the horizon. At first it seemed like nothing, just passing shade. But then the wind got colder, and the clouds rolled faster. A few drops hit the ground, then more. Within half an hour of Paul leaving, it was raining. Not just raining, pouring. A full desert downpour. One of those rare spring storms that comes fast and hits hard. We were soaked in minutes, but I remember smiling. We were drenched, but we were drinking, holding our hands up, licking the drops from our sleeves, our skin, trying to catch water in our mouths. It was cold and wild, but it saved us in that moment. We sat under a bush and let the rain fall, letting it hit our lips, soaking our shirts and pants. We didn't have bottles to catch it in, but at least it was something. The rain kept on for a while, then let up. The desert changed fast. Dry washes became little rivers. The trail turned to clay and muck. The air smelled like sage and wet dirt. It was beautiful in a strange, surreal way. But then time started dragging. Paul had been gone for hours. I kept looking down the road, waiting to see the van bouncing up toward us. Nothing. Evening came. Still no van. My mom and I started walking. We weren't sure what else to do. She said if Paul was having trouble driving, maybe he'd parked and was walking back. Maybe we'd meet him on the road. But the walking was harder now. The mud stuck to our shoes and made each step feel like dragging weights. We pushed forward slowly, the road turning into a slick mess. It was nearly dark when we crested a rise and saw it. A small dirt lot, empty except for one familiar van parked dead center. But the engine wasn't running. The windows were dark, and standing outside it, soaked in mud and swearing under his breath, was Paul trying to start the thing. He looked up when he saw us, relief and frustration all over his face. Dead battery. He'd made it to the van, but the battery had died somewhere along the way. He'd tried pushing, priming, everything he could think of, but it was no use. The rain had flooded parts of the road, and the van couldn't get traction even if it had started. There were no other vehicles, no signs of people. We were in the middle of nowhere, miles from pavement. Paul didn't waste time. He stripped off his wet outer layer, put his muddy shirt back on, grabbed the bike again, and rode off down the road, this time toward the main highway, 6 miles further. The sky was dark again. The clouds had broken a bit, but the moon hadn't risen yet. My mom and I crawled into the van. It was dry inside, at least. We wrapped up in what little we had left, some emergency blankets, a damp sleeping bag, and a few spare clothes, and waited. That night was cold. Not freezing, but wet and shivering cold. Every few hours I dozed off. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend getaway. Just me and the cabin tucked away deep in the woods. I had booked it last month, needing a break from everything. My life in the city had become too loud, too busy, and I thought a weekend in isolation would clear my head. The cabin, located in the middle of nowhere, was perfect. No distractions, no people, just nature. The drive there was long, taking me out of the city and up winding roads that seemed to stretch on forever. By the time I finally saw the cabin in the distance, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. The place looked exactly as described in the listing: rustic, charming, and isolated. It was built of old wood with a steep roof, and the porch had a couple of old rocking chairs that creaked with the wind. The trees around it seemed to stand guard, the forest thick and dark. I got out of my car, stretched, and grabbed my bag. The air was fresh, cool, and clean, nothing like the smog I'd been breathing for the past few months. I stepped onto the porch and unlocked the door. The smell of pine and wood hit me immediately as I entered. The inside was exactly what I wanted, simple. There was a fireplace in the living room, a couch, a couple of chairs, a dining table, and a small kitchen. Everything was functional, if a little worn down. I threw my things on the couch and went to the small back porch to take in the view. It was breathtaking. The cabin was on the edge of a cliff, and below was a valley filled with thick trees and rocks. The view stretched on for miles. I could hear the wind rustling the branches and the distant call of a bird, but there was no sign of life anywhere nearby. It was just me and the wilderness. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, I started a fire in the wood stove. I wasn't sure what to do with myself, but I was content to simply sit and watch the flames. The crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of the wind outside were the only sounds. I didn't feel scared, but there was something strange about the silence here. It wasn't peaceful, it was suffocating. The kind of silence you get when something is wrong, though you can't put your finger on what it is. I cooked myself some dinner, simple stuff, pasta and sauce. I ate slowly, savoring each bite, trying to push the unease that was slowly creeping up on me. The silence outside was still there, but now it felt different. It was too still, too quiet. Even the wind had died down, and the birds had stopped singing. It was as if the whole forest had decided to hold its breath. After eating, I decided to head to bed early. I had nothing else to do, and my body was tired from the long drive. The bedroom was small but comfortable. The bed was an old iron frame with a thick quilt on top. The walls were lined with bookshelves, filled with old novels and various knickknacks. I crawled under the covers and turned off the lamp, hoping to fall asleep quickly. But as I lay there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The stillness outside was oppressive, and I kept hearing strange sounds. At first, I thought it was just the wind moving the trees, but the more I listened, the more I realized that the sounds were too close. There was a faint scratching noise, like something was moving against the walls. I sat up in bed, straining to hear. The scratching stopped, but then came the sound of something heavy moving across the floor, slow and deliberate. My heart began to race. I sat frozen for what felt like hours, but the sounds didn't come again. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of birds chirping and the soft light filtering through the trees outside. It was a beautiful day, and I decided to go for a hike to get my mind off the strange noises from the night before. I packed a small bag with water and snacks, put on my boots, and left the cabin. The air was cool, but not cold, and the ground was soft beneath my feet. The forest was alive with the sounds of animals and insects, and for the first time since I arrived, I felt a little better. I hiked for hours, exploring the surrounding woods. The trees seemed to close in around me, and the deeper I went, the more isolated I felt. The further I wandered, the more I realized how quiet everything was. Even though I could hear the occasional bird or rustle of leaves, it still felt unnervingly quiet. There was no sound of squirrels or small animals scurrying in the underbrush, no distant sounds of anything living except the trees themselves. It was unnatural. When I finally returned to the cabin, the sun was beginning to set. I had hoped the hike would shake off the feeling that something was wrong, but it didn't. It was worse now, and I couldn't ignore it. I tried to push it out of my mind as I started preparing dinner, but the feeling only grew stronger. I kept checking the windows, expecting to see someone or something out there, but every time I looked, all I saw were trees swaying gently in the wind. That night, I tried to distract myself. I made a fire, cooked dinner, and sat down with a book. But I couldn't focus. I kept hearing things. The occasional creak of the floorboards, the soft tap, tap, tap of something on the window. I told myself it was just the house settling, that it was just my imagination running wild. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. At one point, I got up to check the windows. I moved slowly, creeping across the room. The firelight flickered in the dimly lit cabin, casting long shadows. I reached the window and peeked outside. Nothing, just the trees swaying in the breeze. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something movement. I quickly turned my head, but there was nothing there. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared out into the darkening woods, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. I sat down, trying to breathe slowly, calming my racing heart. I told myself it was just the wind, playing tricks on my mind. But when I looked back at the window, the feeling of being watched had returned. I wasn't sure how long I sat there, staring out into the dark, but it felt like hours. The fear, the unease, it was building in my chest. The fire crackled in the corner, but the room felt colder now. The warmth of the flames not enough to push away the chill creeping along the walls. I decided it was time to go to bed. I grabbed my flashlight, making sure to lock the door behind me, and went to my room. As I lay in bed, the sounds started again. First, a light tapping like fingers on the window. Then, a scraping noise, louder this time, coming from the floorboards outside my room. I felt my pulse quicken, my body frozen in fear. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to look, but I had to. I got out of bed slowly, holding the flashlight tightly in my hands. I crept to the door, my heart thudding in my chest. I opened it just a crack and shined the light into the hall. Nothing. The cabin was still eerily so. But then I saw something, a shadow moving quickly down the hallway. My heart skipped a beat as I rushed to shut the door, but I couldn't shake the image of it. The figure moving fast, like it knew exactly where it was going. I spent the rest of the night in a panic, unable to sleep, too terrified to even move. By morning, I was exhausted. My mind was racing with thoughts of what I had seen, what had happened. I decided to leave. I didn't stay another night. I packed up my things, locked the cabin, and drove away as fast as I could. The woods, the silence, the things I had heard, all of it felt wrong. I never went back. I never wanted to. It's already late in the afternoon, and the air outside feels thick, like it's about to rain. I'm standing on the old wooden porch of a small cabin I rented for the weekend, hoping for some peace. This cabin is in the middle of nowhere, nestled deep in the woods. No neighbors for miles, nothing but the trees and the wild. It's just what I needed, an escape. The first thing I notice as I step inside is the smell. It's that mix of old wood, the slight hint of dust, and something else, something I can't quite place. The floor creaks under my feet as I walk through the entrance, the wooden beams overhead showing their age. The cabin is simple, just what I expected. A small living room with a fireplace, a kitchen that's more rustic than practical, and a staircase leading up to a loft bedroom. The furniture is mismatched, all old but still functional. It's cozy in a way, but there's something about it that feels off. I unpack my bag, hang up my jacket, and set my boots by the door. I'm here to relax, to clear my head. The plan was simple. Spend the weekend hiking, reading, and not thinking about anything. But already, I can't shake the feeling that I've made some kind of mistake. The evening creeps in slowly, the sky outside darkens, and the first drops of rain begin to fall. I sit down by the fire, letting the warmth from the crackling flames wash over me. The sound of the rain on the roof is calming. At first, a steady rhythm that almost lulls me into a trance. I sip on a cup of coffee, staring at the fire. The room feels smaller than it should, the shadows growing longer as the light flickers. It's not long before I hear it. Faint creak. I freeze. The kind of sound a floorboard makes when someone walks across it. Even if I'm the only one here, my heart skips a beat, and I glance around, but everything looks normal. I brush it off as the house settling, old wood and shifting foundations, nothing to worry about. But then it happens again. A soft creak, closer this time. It's coming from upstairs, above the loft. I stand up, my hand instinctively reaching for the flashlight in my pocket. I know there's no one else in the cabin, but the sound, it's not right. My stomach turns in a knot. The thought of someone being up there, in a place I thought was empty, makes my skin crawl. I take a slow, cautious step toward the stairs. My flashlight beam flicks across the walls as I climb, and I try to calm my nerves, telling myself it's probably nothing. Maybe a branch rubbing against the window, or just the house making noise in the storm. But I don't believe it. Not entirely. When I reach the top, the landing is dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the fire downstairs. The bedroom door is ajar, just a crack, as if someone had left it that way. My breath catches in my throat. I should have locked the door. I push it open slowly, the hinges squealing a little. The room is empty. The bed, made up neatly, the curtains drawn tight against the night. Everything is where it should be. Still, I feel something heavy in the air, like the room is watching me. I shake it off. It's nothing. I'm being ridiculous. I turn to leave but stop when I see something odd. There's a piece of paper on the floor, just inside the door. It looks like it's been there for a while, its edges curled and weathered. I crouch down to pick it up, my fingers brushing against the brittle paper. The handwriting is messy, almost frantic. Don't trust the woods. They're always listening. They've seen you. The words send a chill up my spine. My hands tremble slightly as I fold the paper, stuff it in my pocket, and quickly leave the room. The rain has picked up now, pounding against the windows, and the wind howls outside, making the cabin creak again. I tell myself it's just a prank, or maybe the previous tenant left it behind. The whole thing feels strange, but I refuse to let my mind spiral. I go back downstairs, pour myself another cup of coffee, and try to distract myself with a book. But the silence in the cabin feels louder now, somehow. Presses in on me, makes it harder to focus. Hours pass, the storm showing no signs of letting up. I'm feeling restless, my eyes flicking around the room every few minutes, like something's just out of sight. The shadows seem to shift, the air growing colder. I close the book and decide to go to bed. Maybe a good night's sleep will shake this feeling. The bed is surprisingly comfortable, the quilt thick and warm. But sleep doesn't come easily. My mind races, spinning over the note I found, the creaking sounds upstairs, the feeling that something's off. I roll over and pull the covers tighter around me, but the unease doesn't fade. And then I hear it, a soft thump, followed by another, the sound of something moving around upstairs. I freeze, my heartbeat quickens, and I listen closely, my ears straining in the dark. It's coming from the loft, right above me. Someone or something is up there. I can't move. I'm paralyzed by the thought. I'm alone. No one else is supposed to be here. The thumping continues, like footsteps pacing slowly back and forth. I swallow hard, trying to steady my breath. I could leave. I could grab my things and run out into the storm, but the thought of going outside into that darkness, it's worse than staying in the cabin. I decide to call it out, to try to reason with whoever or whatever might be up there, but my voice is trapped in my throat, the words caught in fear. Instead, I just lie there, listening to the slow, deliberate steps overhead. I don't know how long it goes on. Minutes? Hours? The clock on the wall tells me it's already past midnight, but the night feels endless. Then the sound stops. Complete silence. I wait. The hairs on my neck stand up, and my pulse thunders in my ears. And then another sound. A door creaks open upstairs. The same door I'd left ajar earlier. I know it's that door. Without thinking, I slip out of bed and grab the flashlight from the nightstand. My hands are shaking. I make my way upstairs, each step creaking under my weight, the flashlight beam cutting through the dark. The loft is still, but the door to the bedroom is wide open now. I walk closer, my heart racing. As I peer inside, the room is empty, just as it was before. I'm about to turn around to go back downstairs when I hear something. A faint scratching sound coming from behind the wall, like nails dragging across wood. It's so quiet, I almost wonder if I imagined it. But then it happens again, louder this time. I back away slowly, not sure what to do. My mind is running in circles, trying to figure out what's happening. But there's no rational explanation. I reach for the doorknob to leave the room, but before I can touch it, the door slams shut behind me with a deafening crash. My heart stops and I freeze. I spin around, breathing heavily, but there's nothing. Just the silent, suffocating darkness. I look around in a panic, my mind racing. The walls feel like they're closing in on me. The scratching continues, louder now, coming from everywhere. I can't tell if it's the walls or the floor, but it's too much. The room is spinning. Suddenly, there's a knock at the door, loud, sharp, and unmistakable. I don't know who would be out there in the storm, but I'm not opening that door. I feel my legs give way beneath me as I drop to the floor, my breath coming in gasps. I stay on the floor for what feels like hours, paralyzed by fear. The knocking stops. The scratching stops. The cabin is silent again, and I don't move. I can't move. Finally, I hear the storm subsiding outside. The rain is easing up, and I gather enough strength to get up and go to the door. I open it slowly, just enough to peek outside. There's no one there. The air smells fresh now, the storm passed. I don't know what happened that night. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe the cabin is just old and creaky, and I let my fears get the best of me. But I can't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was watching me. I packed my things and left the next morning before sunrise, and I never went back. It was late September when I decided to take a break from everything and rent a remote cabin up in northern Maine. I had been working long hours for almost 2 years straight, barely taking any real time off, and I was getting burnt out. I didn't want to go somewhere touristy or busy. I wanted quiet, isolation. I wanted to wake up to the sound of wind in the trees instead of traffic or emails. I found the cabin through a small listing on a website that wasn't very popular. The pictures showed a small, dark wood cabin set back in thick trees, next to a narrow dirt road that looked like it hadn't been maintained in years. It looked old but sturdy, with no neighbors around. That was the biggest selling point for me. The listing said it had electricity but no Wi-Fi, and cell service was described as inconsistent. That was perfect for what I wanted. I booked it for 2 weeks. I packed everything I thought I'd need. Mostly canned food, water, a small generator for backup, extra clothes, and some books. I also brought a rifle, which I legally owned, mostly for peace of mind. I wasn't planning on hunting, but I'd heard enough about bears in Maine that I didn't want to take any chances. The drive up took most of a day. After I passed through the last town, the road narrowed and turned to gravel. Then it turned to dirt, and I didn't see another car for almost an hour. Eventually, I found the turnoff onto an even smaller road, really more of a trail. The GPS had stopped working by then, but I had printed directions. I followed the dirt trail until the trees opened up slightly, and the cabin came into view. It was just like in the photos, small, one-story, with a tin roof and a short porch out front. The woods pressed in close behind it, and the nearest power line was miles back. When I stepped out of the car, the first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. No distant cars, No voices, not even the hum of wires. Just wind and birds and the occasional rustling of leaves. The air was sharp and clean. Felt good to breathe in. The cabin was unlocked, as the owner had said it would be. Inside, it was simple. One main room with a small wood stove, a table and 2 chairs, and a cot pushed against the back wall. There was a small kitchen area with a propane stove and a battered mini fridge powered by a generator out back. A narrow door led to a small bathroom with a compost toilet and a rust-stained sink. Everything smelled faintly of old wood and smoke. I set my things down, checked that the windows locked, and started to unpack. The first 2 days passed peacefully. I woke up with the sun, read for hours, walked down trails that led deeper into the forest. I cooked simple meals, sometimes just beans and rice. I didn't see a single person, not even a hiker. The only sounds were natural. Wind in the trees, birds, the occasional animal moving through the underbrush. It was exactly what I needed. But on the 3rd night, I was woken up by something strange. It was maybe 2 in the morning, and I'd been asleep for a few hours. I wasn't dreaming. I woke up suddenly, heart pounding, no idea why. The cabin was completely dark. I always shut everything off at night to save power. The wind outside had picked up a little, but there was something else. A sound. It was faint, but it wasn't wind or animals. It was rhythmic, like a tapping, not constant. Just a few slow taps, then silence, then another few taps. I sat up on the cot and stayed still. The sound wasn't inside. It was coming from outside, near the front. I waited for a few more minutes, barely breathing, trying to figure out what it could be. It didn't sound like an animal. It sounded deliberate, almost like someone lightly knocking on the wood wall. Eventually, it stopped. I sat awake for another hour, just listening. I didn't hear it again, and I finally drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I walked around the cabin, looking for anything unusual. There were no footprints, but the ground was covered in leaves and pine needles, so that didn't prove much. I checked the walls. No scratches, no marks. Everything looked the same. I told myself it was probably a branch or an animal, maybe a raccoon bumping around. But something about the rhythm of the tapping had unsettled me. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept the rifle next to the cot and I left a lantern on low just in case. Around 1:30 a.m., I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. A pause, then tap, tap. I stood up quietly and moved to the front window, but I didn't open it. I pulled back the curtain just an inch. The porch was dark, the trees beyond even darker. I couldn't see anything moving, but the sound kept happening. It was definitely on the front side of the cabin. Then it stopped again. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, I felt stupid. I hadn't seen anything. It was probably nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been outside. That day, I walked a wide circle around the cabin, checking the woods. I didn't find anything. No tents, no gear, no signs of anyone camping nearby. Just trees and rocks and the occasional squirrel or bird. I tried to brush it off. Still, that night, I didn't turn the lantern off. The tapping didn't come again for a few nights. I started to relax again, thinking maybe it really had just been some animal, maybe a bird or even a porcupine. But on the 6th night, something worse happened. I was outside around dusk, just finishing off a can of soup over the fire pit I'd made. It was getting cold, and the sun was just about gone. I stood up to head inside, and that's when I saw something in the dirt. Footprints. They weren't mine. I wore heavy boots, and these were from shoes, sneakers, or something lighter. The prints came from the edge of the woods and stopped near the corner of the cabin. Then they turned around and went back. They were fresh. I would have seen them before if they'd been there earlier. Someone had come up to the cabin, circled it, and left. I got cold all over. I looked into the trees, but I couldn't see anything. The forest felt darker than before, even though it wasn't fully night yet. I grabbed my rifle and went back inside, locking the door behind me. I didn't turn off any of the lights that night. I sat up for hours listening. No tapping this time. No sounds at all. The next morning, I packed up most of my food and gear and drove into the nearest town, which was nearly 2 hours away. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I just bought extra batteries, more gas for the generator, and a game camera. One of those motion-activated ones used for hunting or security. I set it up on a tree facing the front of the cabin when I got back. If someone came around again, I'd get a picture. The night stayed quiet after that. Nothing on the camera for 3 days. Then on the 4th morning, I checked the memory card and found something. At 2:14 a.m., someone walked up to the cabin. The photo was grainy and dark, but you could see the outline clearly. A man, medium build, maybe in his 30s or 40s, wearing a hooded sweatshirt. His face was hard to see, turned slightly away from the camera. He stood on the porch for a few seconds, then turned around and walked off into the trees. I stared at that photo for a long time. I had proof now. I wasn't imagining it. Someone was out here. But why? He didn't knock, didn't try the door, didn't leave anything. Just stood there and left. That was somehow worse. I didn't know if he'd be back or not. I considered leaving early, but something about that felt like giving up. I only had 4 more nights. I told myself I could wait it out. The next night, I didn't sleep at all. I kept the rifle in my lap and sat in the chair by the front window. I watched the porch until sunrise. Nobody came. The forest outside looked normal again, peaceful. But the next night, I heard something new. Not tapping, something heavier. Movement behind the cabin. Footsteps in the leaves. Slow, deliberate, then silence. I opened the back window a crack, but I couldn't see anything through the trees. Then something brushed against the back wall. Not tapping, dragging, like fingers or a stick being slowly dragged across the wood. I moved to the back door, gun raised, but I didn't open it. I waited. My heart was pounding in my chest. Then silence again. I stayed up until dawn. When I finally stepped outside, there were long marks on the back wall. Not deep, just streaks in the dust and pollen. But they were long, like someone had dragged their hand across it. There were more footprints too around the back. The same kind of sneakers. I downloaded the camera again. This time there were 2 photos. One at 2:07 a.m. and another at 2:11 a.m. The same man, just standing there. This time facing the camera. His face was pale and expressionless. His eyes looked directly at the lens. That was the last straw. I packed everything. I didn't even care that it was dark out. I loaded the car in 10 minutes, not even bothering to clean up. I left the camera on the tree. I just drove. By the time I hit the main road, it was almost 4 a.m. I drove straight through until I reached the next town with a police station. I didn't report it as a crime. There was no break-in. I decided to spend a few days alone in a small cabin I found listed on a rental site. It was mid-October, the leaves had already turned, and I was starting to feel the usual weight of work and life pressing down. I thought a few days off the grid would help me reset. The cabin was located in the northern part of Maine, about an hour's drive from the nearest town. The listing said it had solar power for lights, a small stove that ran on propane, and a wood-burning heater. No Wi-Fi, no cell service. That was exactly what I wanted. I drove up in my old Subaru, packed with enough food and water for 5 days. I brought a camp stove too, just in case, and a small cooler with ice packs. I had a few books, a journal, a flashlight, and extra batteries. The drive took longer than I expected because the road turned to dirt for the last 12 miles and was full of deep ruts and mud. I had to go slow. My tires kicked up mud and leaves, and at one point I thought I might get stuck, but I made it. The cabin was just like the pictures. A small wooden building with a single room, a small porch, and a chimney poking out the top. There were no other buildings in sight. The trees were tall and packed tight together, and the sky was already starting to dim when I arrived. The temperature dropped quickly once the sun dipped below the trees, so I got to work unloading my gear and getting the inside ready. The inside of the cabin smelled like old wood and dust. It had one bed against the back wall, a small table with 2 chairs, a wood-burning stove in the corner, and some shelves with cookware and canned food the owner had left behind. There was a metal sink with a hand pump that pulled up water from a well below. The water was cold and tasted metallic, but it was clean. There was a small outhouse about 30 feet from the cabin, which wasn't ideal, but I could manage. The place was simple but sturdy. I got the wood stove going first. There was a pile of chopped logs outside, and I brought in a few armfuls. I'd never used a wood-burning stove before, but I had watched some videos before coming. Took a few tries, but eventually I got a small fire going. I warmed up a can of soup on the propane burner and ate it with some bread. By the time I cleaned up, it was already dark outside. The forest beyond the windows was pitch black. The first night was quiet. I laid in bed under thick blankets and listened to the wind move through the trees. Every now and then I'd hear a creak from the wood of the cabin settling, or a crack from outside, probably branches falling. I had to keep reminding myself that the woods are full of sounds and that none of them meant anything. I eventually fell asleep. I woke up early, just before the sun came up. The inside of the cabin was cold. The fire had died out sometime in the night, so I climbed out of bed and restarted it. I made coffee with a small percolator I'd brought and sat on the porch wrapped in a blanket, watching the forest wake up. It was peaceful in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. The only sounds were birds and the occasional scurry of a squirrel or chipmunk through the underbrush. I didn't have any plans for the day. I walked a little on a narrow trail that started behind the cabin, but I didn't go far. I wasn't trying to get lost out there. I spent most of the day reading and writing in my journal. I kept the fire going, made simple meals, and enjoyed the quiet. It was the kind of silence that presses in after a while, but I liked it. I had no one to talk to, no screens, no news, nothing pulling at my attention. I went to bed early that night, listening to the fire pop and the wind outside. The next day started the same. Cold morning, fire, coffee. I walked the trail a little farther this time. It twisted and turned through dense woods, with thick roots underfoot and tall pine trees on either side. I noticed small things, like the sound of my boots on the leaves, or the way the light broke through the canopy above in thin beams. After about half an hour, I came across a clearing. It wasn't very large, maybe 20 feet across. In the middle of it was what looked like a broken-down wooden structure. Just the frame of something, almost like an old hunting blind or tree stand that had fallen apart. There were splinters of old wood, some rusty nails, and a few pieces of weathered rope tied around the frame. Felt weird being there. I couldn't say why exactly. Maybe because it didn't seem like it belonged. The structure didn't look like it had been used in decades. Nature had started reclaiming it. Moss on the wood, a tree growing through the side. I stood there for a while, not really thinking anything specific, just looking at it. Then I turned and walked back. When I got back to the cabin, everything was the same. I had lunch, chopped more firewood, and sat on the porch again for a while. But something felt different. It wasn't anything I could point to, just a slight unease in my stomach that wouldn't go away. I brushed it off and kept myself busy. That night, though, I had trouble sleeping. I kept waking up, hearing things outside. Small cracks, then silence. I tell myself it was the wind or maybe animals, but it didn't help me fall back asleep. The third night, I woke up around 2 a.m. I didn't know why at first. I just sat up, cold air hitting me like a slap. The fire had gone out again. I listened. For a few minutes, I didn't hear anything. Then, I heard the soft sound of leaves being stepped on outside. Slow, not constant. One step, then a pause. Then another. Then nothing. My heart started racing. I stayed completely still, eyes on the wall, ears straining. The cabin had no curtains, just bare glass. I didn't want to move toward the window, but I needed to know if someone was out there. I got up slowly, careful not to make noise. I crept toward the window beside the door and leaned just enough to peek out. I couldn't see anything, just blackness and the dim shape of trees. I waited, 5 minutes, maybe more. No more sounds, no more steps. Eventually I backed away and sat on the bed, wide awake. I didn't sleep again that night. In the morning, I checked around the cabin. I looked for footprints or anything out of place, but the ground was covered in fallen leaves. And if there were tracks, I couldn't see them. I started to wonder if I had imagined it. Maybe I'd heard an animal. Maybe I was dreaming, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I decided not to go back on the trail again. I stayed close to the cabin the rest of the day. I kept the fire going strong and brought extra wood inside so I wouldn't have to go out at night. That night, it was quiet at first. I fell asleep sometime after 10. But I woke up again, just past midnight, and I heard the steps again. This time they were slower, closer. Still one at a time, but closer to the cabin. My skin went cold. I sat up and didn't move. Then I heard what sounded like a hand brushing against the side of the wall. A dragging sound, slow, like fingers along wood. It circled around the cabin. I could track the sound as it moved. I stared at the door, heart beating like a drum. Then it stopped. Dead silence. I didn't move for what felt like an hour. I gripped my flashlight but didn't turn it on. I just sat there, frozen, until I started to see the light of dawn creeping in. When the sun came up, I stepped outside. I felt exposed. I checked the area around the cabin again, but I didn't find anything. Not a footprint, not a broken branch, nothing. I started seriously thinking about leaving early. I still had 2 days left, but my nerves were shot. I packed some of my things but decided to wait one more day. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't want to admit I was scared. Maybe I still thought I could shake the feeling off. That afternoon, I heard a sound in the woods, not far off the trail. It was like something heavy had snapped a branch. I walked toward the sound about 10 feet, but I couldn't see anything. Then I noticed something that hadn't been there before. A piece of rope hanging from a tree about eye level, tied in a loop. Not a noose, just a loop. But it wasn't there the day before. I didn't touch it. I backed up slowly and went inside the cabin. That night, I barely slept. I kept the fire burning hot, the flashlight in my hand, and my boots on. Around 1 a.m., I heard the dragging sound again. This time, it wasn't just one side. It moved all around the cabin. I heard creaks on the porch, then silence, then 3 hard knocks on the door. My blood turned to ice. I didn't move. The knocks came again. 3 spaced out, then nothing. I waited. 10 minutes, then 20. Nothing. I didn't sleep at all after that. At sunrise, I made my decision. I packed everything quickly. I didn't even eat. I shoved my gear into bags and loaded the car. As I was throwing the last of it in, I noticed something on the porch I hadn't seen before. A dead squirrel, laid out in the center of the step, with a small pile of stones beside it. The stones were stacked carefully in a little pyramid. That was it. I got in the car and started driving. The dirt road felt longer than I remembered. I kept checking the rearview mirror, heart pounding until I finally reached the paved road and got cell service again. I didn't stop until I was nearly an hour away. When I got home, I didn't tell anyone the full story. I just said the trip didn't go as planned. I rented the cabin because I needed a break. My job had been crushing me for months, and I just wanted to be alone for a while. Somewhere quiet, away from people, traffic, and the constant noise. I found the place online. It wasn't listed on the big rental sites, just a plain old website with a few pictures and a short description. The photos showed a small wooden cabin tucked deep in the woods somewhere in northern Idaho, next to a lake. It looked old, but not in a bad way, just aged. Solid wood, a little stone chimney, and a rickety-looking dock that stretched into the water. I liked that. It didn't look touristy. No bright signs, no cabin theme. Just plain, quiet, isolated. I emailed the owner and wired over the payment. They sent back instructions, how to get the key from the box nailed to the side of the door, how to turn on the old propane-powered lights, where the emergency batteries and the solar charger were kept. It all seemed normal enough. I packed up a bunch of supplies in a cooler, made sure my car was full of gas, and drove the 8 hours from Boise to get there. The last part of the drive was rough. Once I left the paved roads, it was 20 miles of bumpy, winding dirt paths through tall pine forests. No signs, no cell signal, just dirt, trees, and the occasional old rusted sign nailed to a tree to reassure me I hadn't gone completely the wrong way. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already low in the sky and the forest was swallowing the light. The cabin looked exactly like the pictures. Weathered, quiet, and totally alone. No houses nearby, no trails, no cars, no people. Just me, the trees, and the lake. I got out of the car and stretched. The air smelled like pine needles and water. It was cooler than I expected for late August. A soft breeze stirred the leaves overhead. I walked up to the cabin, grabbed the key from the box, and let myself in. The inside was simple: one room with a bed on one side, a wood-burning stove, a table with 2 chairs, a little kitchenette with a pump sink, and a narrow door that led to a small bathroom with a compost toilet. It was rustic but clean. No signs of bugs or mice. No weird smells. Just wood and dust and silence. I dropped my cooler on the counter and unpacked. I brought canned food, dry snacks, some bottled water, and a few changes of clothes. I didn't need much. The owner had said the lake was safe to swim in and the filter in the pump sink worked, but I brought my own water just in case. There were a few old books on a shelf and a stack of firewood next to the stove. The lights ran off propane, and there was a small panel to turn them on. I tested one, they worked fine. There was even an old battery radio, though I didn't think I'd use it much. That first night was peaceful. I sat on the little dock for a while, watching the moon rise over the lake. It was silent in a way that almost made my ears ring. No traffic, no voices, no machines. Just frogs, bugs, and the occasional owl. I went to bed early and slept hard. The next morning, I woke up at dawn. The cabin was chilly, so I lit the stove and made some instant coffee. I sat on the porch steps and drank it slowly while the sun climbed through the trees. Everything felt perfect. I decided to stay off my phone the whole time. It wasn't getting service anyway. I turned it off and tossed it in my backpack. For the next 2 days, I settled into a rhythm. I fished in the lake a little, though I didn't catch much. I hiked around the edge of the water, keeping track of where I was so I didn't get lost. The forest was dense but not impossible to navigate. I cooked simple meals, read old books, and just sat outside for hours doing nothing. It was exactly what I needed. But on the 3rd day, something started to feel off. It began with small things. That morning, I found one of the folding chairs on the dock tipped over. I hadn't used it the day before, and there wasn't much wind overnight. I figured maybe it had just slowly shifted and fallen. Later, I noticed the pump faucet in the kitchen was dripping. It hadn't been doing that before. I tightened it. That night, I thought I heard a creaking noise outside, like someone stepped on the porch. I froze in bed, listening. I didn't move for 10 minutes, just staring at the ceiling and listening. Nothing followed. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep, telling myself it was probably an animal. The next morning, I walked down to the dock to sit with my coffee and found a small pile of stones at the edge of it, neatly stacked. 5 or 6 smooth lake stones, balanced in a little tower. I didn't put them there. It made my skin prickle. I looked around the woods, trying to spot movement, but there was nothing. Just quiet trees and the glassy surface of the lake. I walked back to the cabin and locked the door behind me, even though I hadn't been locking it before. I kept telling myself there had to be some logical reason. Maybe some bored hikers were messing around. Maybe a kid from a nearby cabin. But there weren't supposed to be other cabins for miles. That's what the owner told me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing soft, inconsistent sounds. Cracks in the underbrush, a faint shuffle, the kind of noises that stop as soon as you try to listen hard. At one point, I sat up in bed and looked toward the window. There was nothing there, just dark glass reflecting the inside of the cabin. I left the lights off and stayed still for over an hour, listening. The next morning, I found something that really scared me. On the dirt path leading from the cabin to the dock, there were footprints. Human footprints, barefoot. They weren't mine. I hadn't been barefoot at all outside. They were smaller than mine, too. I crouched and looked at them closely. The prints were clear and fresh. Toes heel the arch. They came from the woods, crossed the path, and then disappeared back into the trees. I followed them a little way, but they got harder to see the farther they went. I stopped after about 30 feet. The woods were too thick, and I didn't want to get lost. I walked back fast, heart pounding. When I reached the cabin, I locked the door behind me again. I stayed inside most of that day. I didn't want to admit I was scared, but I was My brain kept trying to come up with normal explanations. Some nature-loving hiker wandered through barefoot, maybe, but nothing made sense. Who walks barefoot through pine forest and doesn't leave any trace beyond a few steps near one isolated cabin? That night, I stayed up late, sitting in the dark with the lights off, just watching and listening. I didn't even use a flashlight. I sat on a chair by the window and kept my eyes on the trees. Around 2 a.m., I saw something move, just a shape, fast and low between the trees. I couldn't make out anything more than a shadow. I stood up and backed away from the window. My skin was cold. I didn't sleep at all after that. In the morning, I decided I needed to check the area more carefully. I wanted to find some kind of evidence that I wasn't imagining all of this. I circled the cabin, walking slowly. That's when I noticed scratches on one of the walls. Low to the ground, about knee height. They weren't animal scratches. They looked like someone had scraped the wood deliberately with a sharp rock or maybe a piece of metal. Just 4 or 5 long, shallow lines. Not deep, but fresh. The wood was pale underneath, like it had just been cut. That's when I made the decision to leave. I didn't care if it ruined the rest of my vacation. Something was wrong here. Maybe someone was squatting nearby, or watching me, or worse. I packed up my things fast. I loaded the cooler, stuffed my clothes into my bag, and locked the cabin behind me, even though it didn't feel like that would do much good. I hiked to the car, tossed everything in, and tried to start it. Nothing. The engine didn't even turn over. Just a weak click. I tried again. Same thing. The battery was completely dead. That didn't make sense. I hadn't left the lights on. The battery was fine when I parked. I popped the hood and looked inside. Not that I really knew what I was doing. Nothing looked obviously wrong. I tried again, turning the key. Just a dead, hollow click. I got out and looked around. There was no one to ask for help. No nearby houses, no other cars, no road access for miles. I checked my phone, still no signal. I decided I'd hike out. I had a general sense of the way I came in. I figured if I followed the dirt road back far enough, I'd get a signal or find someone. I loaded up a small pack with water, snacks, and my flashlight. I left the rest of my stuff in the car and started walking. I moved fast. I didn't stop to rest. I didn't hear anything unusual for the first 2 miles, just birds and wind. But at some point, I started to feel like I was being watched. It wasn't even a sound. It was just that prickling sensation at the back of my neck. I kept turning around, expecting to see someone behind me. Nothing. The woods were too quiet. After 4 or 5 miles, I finally got 1 bar of service. I stood still and called for roadside assistance. The call dropped. I walked uphill another 100 feet and tried again. This time it connected. I gave them my location as best I could, and they said someone would come in a few hours. I hiked back down the trail and waited near a turn where the road opened up a little. I sat on a rock, gripping my flashlight even though it was... I was 34 the year I rented a cabin up in northern Washington. The plan was to spend 2 weeks there alone to clear my head and get away from everything. I just left a job I'd been at for nearly 10 years, the kind that drains you slowly until you start forgetting what you even like anymore. My apartment lease had just ended, and I didn't want to sign another one yet. So I booked a place far out in the woods near a lake. No neighbors close by, no cell service, and barely any internet. It sounded like what I needed. The cabin wasn't anything fancy. A small A-frame with a wraparound porch, a single bedroom, a wood stove, and a small kitchen with a propane range. It sat on the edge of a thick forest, with trees so tall and dense you couldn't see far past the first few rows. The lake was about a 10-minute walk down a slope, and a narrow trail led straight to it from the back of the cabin. I got there in early October. The air had that dry, crisp feeling, like everything had cooled down fast but hadn't frozen yet. The leaves were turning orange and red, and they scattered across the gravel driveway as I pulled up. There was a chill, but it felt clean, like the kind of cold you could breathe deep without coughing. I remember thinking it would be the first time in a long while I'd be alone without anyone needing anything from me. The first few days were calm. I spent most of the time reading, walking, and chopping wood to keep the stove going. The nights were quiet in a way that took time to adjust to. No sirens, no traffic, Just wind in the trees and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. I liked the quiet at first, but by the third night it started feeling a little too quiet, like something was waiting for a sound. I chalked it up to my brain adjusting. City life makes you used to noise, and silence can feel loud in its own way. Still, I started noticing things that made me uneasy. Small things. On the fourth morning, I found the woodpile a bit scattered, as if someone had kicked through it. I thought maybe a raccoon or a fox had gone looking for bugs. It didn't look like anything had been taken, just messed up. Later that same day, I was walking back from the lake and noticed a tree near the trail had a long scratch across the bark, about 5 feet off the ground. It looked fresh, deep too. I figured it might be from an animal, maybe a bear, though I hadn't seen any sign of one. No tracks, no scat. I told myself to stay calm, that the woods had their own life, and I was just a visitor. By the fifth night, I started locking the cabin door even though I was miles from the next nearest house. I also started bringing the hatchet inside instead of leaving it out near the chopping block. It felt silly, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That night, around 2 in the morning, I woke up without knowing why. I wasn't having a dream. I just opened my eyes and felt this heavy stillness around me. I lay there listening for something, anything. The wind had stopped. The trees were still. Even the usual sounds of the forest, owls, distant frogs, were missing. Then I heard a soft crunch outside. Just one, like a footstep on dried leaves. I held my breath. My bed was against the back wall, and the window above it looked out over the forest. I turned slowly and peeked out, but I couldn't see anything. It was pitch black. No moon, no stars, just a black sheet of night pressed against the glass. I stayed frozen for a long time, waiting to hear another sound. But it never came. The next morning, I checked the area around the cabin. There were leaves all over the ground, but I couldn't see any prints. I didn't know what I was expecting. If it had been an animal, the prints might have been shallow or hidden by new leaves. Still, I felt watched. Not like someone was staring at me right then, but like someone had been close recently. Too close. I spent the whole day uneasy. I hiked further up the trail than usual, thinking maybe I just needed to move and sweat and let go of the nerves. About a mile in, I found something strange. A pile of rocks, stacked neatly in a little clearing. Maybe 10 or 12 stones balanced carefully. It wasn't big, just about a foot tall. I figured it could have been left by another hiker, or maybe a kid from a nearby house if there was one. But the weird part was that there were no footprints around it. None that I could see, and the area around the pile was cleared of leaves, almost like someone had swept it clean. I didn't stay long. I walked back fast, keeping my eyes on the trees around me. I didn't hear anything, but the silence was different now. It felt tighter, like the forest was holding its breath. That night, I didn't sleep much. I lay in bed listening again. At some point after midnight, I heard what sounded like a knock on the wall outside. Just once. Not loud, more like a tap. I sat up and stared at the door, the windows, the walls. I didn't move for maybe an hour. No more sounds came. The next day, I packed up and drove into the nearest town, which was about an hour away. I bought a trail camera at a sporting goods store. The guy at the counter asked if I was trying to catch something, and I just said I wanted to see what animals were around the cabin. I didn't want to explain that I was scared of something I couldn't name. I set the camera up facing the trail near the cabin that evening. I mounted it to a tree about 4 feet up and made sure the lens had a clear view of the area where I'd found the scratch. I figured if there was an animal or something else coming through, the camera would catch it. That night, I didn't hear anything. I woke up around 3 a.m. and stayed awake until dawn, but it was quiet. When the sun came up, I went straight to the camera. The battery was fine. The SD card was still in. I brought it inside and checked the footage on my laptop. There were 3 clips. The first showed me setting it up. The second was around 1:20 a.m. It showed the forest in grayscale night vision. The wind was moving the trees, and nothing passed by. It was 30 seconds long. The third one chilled me. It was just 8 seconds. At 3:04 a.m., the camera suddenly shook, like someone had grabbed it or hit the tree it was on. Then it cut out. No movement before or after. No shape, no animal, just a sudden jolt and then silence. I walked out to the camera again and checked the tree. There were no claw marks, no damage to the bark, but the lens had a faint smudge on it, like a fingerprint. I hadn't touched that part. I knew I hadn't. From that point on, I didn't sleep through the nights. I started staying up until dawn and napping during the day. I kept the lights on. I shut every curtain. I listened for anything out of place, and still something felt wrong. 3 nights later, I noticed that the trail camera had been moved, just slightly. It was tilted down more than I'd set it. I hadn't touched it since cleaning the smudge. I checked the footage again. Nothing that night, but the angle shift wasn't in my head. The following day, I hiked back to where I saw the stacked rocks. I hadn't been back since that first visit. When I reached the clearing, my stomach turned. There were 3 piles now, all the same height, same kind of rocks, same cleared ground around them. And there, next to the furthest one, was a sock. A single white sock, dirt-stained and stretched out. Not mine. I left immediately. Back at the cabin, I started packing. I didn't care that I had 5 days left on the rental. I didn't care that I didn't have another place lined up. I just knew I didn't want to spend another night there. But before I left, I walked down to the lake one last time. I don't know why. Maybe to say goodbye, or maybe just to see if anything felt different. The trail was quiet. The water was still. I stood at the edge and looked out. That's when I saw it. Across the lake, near the tree line on the opposite shore, something moved. I squinted and saw a figure, too far to see clearly. Not walking, just standing, facing the lake, facing me. I turned and walked back to the cabin fast. I didn't run, but I came close. I loaded everything into the truck and didn't look back. I drove through the winding forest roads until I hit the highway, and I didn't stop until I reached a motel 3 towns away. That night, in the motel bed, I slept. A deep, heavy sleep that I hadn't felt in days. In the morning, I felt like I'd left something behind in those woods. Not a thing, but a feeling. Pressure. Like something watching. Weeks passed. I tried to forget about it, but it stayed with me. Not just the fear, but the mystery. So I checked news from that area sometimes. Not obsessively, but every now and then. About a month after I left, I saw a short article. A hunter had gone missing near the same forest. His truck was found parked at a trailhead not far from where my cabin had been. They found a small camp he'd set up, but no sign of him. No blood, no gear missing, just gone. The article said search parties found 3 rock piles in a clearing, but nothing else. I never went back. I never found out who or what had been around that cabin. But I know it wasn't an animal. I know it wasn't nothing. Sometimes when I take walks alone, I still feel that tightness, that pressure in the air, like the woods are breathing around me, like they remember me. I don't camp alone anymore. I don't go deep into the trees. I rented a cabin in southern Colorado in late October of 2022. It was just outside a town called Westcliff, right near the edge of the San Isabel National Forest. I found the place through a vacation rental site. The photos made it look perfect for what I needed. Total solitude. I wanted to get away from everything. No emails, no work calls, no people. I didn't even tell most friends I was leaving. Just packed up my old SUV and drove south from Denver with enough supplies to last a week. The cabin sat at the end of a long, narrow dirt road that twisted through thick patches of pine and aspen. The last 2 miles were rough and had no cell reception, so I made sure to download the map before leaving town. The road wound higher and higher until the trees opened up into a small clearing. That's where the cabin stood. It was a 1-story log structure with a covered porch and a stone chimney. The roof was metal, slightly rusted, and pine needles covered most of it. Behind the cabin, the woods continued for miles. The place was exactly what I hoped for. No neighbors, no traffic, just the wind through the trees and the occasional chirp of birds. I unloaded my gear. A few bins of canned food, some dry goods, a cooler of fresh stuff, a propane stove, a cot, a sleeping bag, and a couple of lanterns. The cabin had no electricity or running water, just a wood-burning stove, an old table, and a few chairs. There was an outhouse a little way into the trees. The first day went by quietly. I read a bit, hiked down a nearby game trail, collected firewood, and got a fire going inside the stove. The air turned sharp after sunset, and by nightfall it was well below freezing. The stove kept the inside tolerable, and I bundled up tight before getting into my sleeping bag. I didn't hear anything strange that night, just the crackle of the fire and a few branches popping outside as they cooled. On the second day, I explored a bit farther out. I followed the trail deeper into the woods, just walking without any real goal. The forest was thick but not overgrown. The trees were tall, spaced far enough apart to see for maybe 50 or 60 feet in any direction. The ground was mostly dry leaves and pine needles. Around mid-afternoon, I came across what looked like a hunting blind, but it was old, broken down. Just a few planks nailed into a tree and a pile of rusted cans nearby. I took a few photos, then turned back before it got too late. That night was colder. The wind picked up, and the sky clouded over. I kept the fire going longer and closed the shutters over the small windows. I was just starting to doze off when I heard something outside. It wasn't an animal sound. It was soft, irregular, like footsteps but not close, maybe 20 or 30 feet away, crunching over dry leaves. I stayed still and listened. It stopped after a minute or two. I told myself it was probably a deer or elk. The third day, I stayed closer to the cabin. I had a strange feeling I couldn't shake. I chalked it up to the isolation. Sometimes being alone too long messes with your head. I kept busy chopping wood, boiling water from the creek, and tidying up. Around noon, I walked out to the edge of the clearing to check the road. That's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A set of tire tracks. They were faint, but they hadn't been there when I arrived. I would have noticed. The dirt had been mostly undisturbed. Now there were two parallel grooves curving off the main path, stopping just before the tree line. It looked like a vehicle had turned around there. No fresh footprints, no sign of anyone getting out, but the tracks were fresh. They hadn't had time to wash out from the rain 2 days ago. That put them sometime in the last 24 hours. I felt uneasy but told myself it might have been someone turning around. Maybe a hunter or someone checking land boundaries. Still, it bugged me. I made sure to lock the cabin door that night. It only had a basic latch, nothing that would stop anyone determined, but it gave me some peace of mind. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept hearing faint noises. Not constant, but just enough to make me sit up and listen. Around 2 a.m., I heard a distinct creak from the porch. Then it was quiet again. I waited, heart pounding, straining my ears. Nothing. Eventually, I fell asleep from exhaustion. On day 4, I walked back down the dirt road to check the tracks again. This time, I brought my camera. The grooves were still there, but something else caught my eye. A cigarette, but near the edge of the road. Not buried in dirt or washed out. It looked fresh. I don't smoke, and no one had been out there with me. I picked it up using a stick and dropped it into a plastic bag. Back at the cabin, I started noticing small changes. My lantern had been moved slightly, not far, just a foot or so to the left. A can of beans I left on the counter was turned around. My boots were dry, but the laces looked different, like someone had untied and retied them. None of it was obvious unless you were really paying attention. I started to think maybe I was being paranoid. Still, I kept my hatchet next to my sleeping bag that night. The 5th day, I found something that confirmed I wasn't imagining it. Behind the cabin, about 30 feet into the woods, I found a used tissue and a small plastic wrapper. Not mine. I don't use tissues and I pack out all my trash. The ground nearby had some disturbed leaves, like someone had crouched there. I scanned the trees, the slope behind the cabin, everywhere I could. Nothing. That day, I didn't go far. I stayed near the cabin, constantly watching the woods. I kept thinking someone was out there, watching. I didn't eat much. I barely lit a fire. I just waited for night to come. When it did, I locked up again, loaded my hatchet into my sleeping bag, and lay there awake for hours. Sometime after midnight, I heard something heavy hit the porch. It wasn't loud, more like a thud. Then a dragging sound. I sat up and froze. The stove had gone out, so it was pitch black inside. I didn't dare turn on my flashlight. I just listened. The dragging stopped. Then silence. I stayed like that until morning, not sleeping at all. The next morning, I opened the door slowly, expecting to see something strange. But the porch looked normal. No marks, no objects out of place. I walked around the cabin in a wide circle. Nothing. Then I looked up. There was a small rope tied to one of the trees, high up, maybe 15 feet. It dangled loosely, with the end frayed like it had been cut. I checked the ground underneath. A few scuffed footprints, but not clear enough to tell much. I decided that was it. I wasn't staying another night. I packed up fast, loaded everything into the SUV, and locked the cabin behind me. As I drove down the dirt road, I kept checking the rearview mirror. Nothing followed me, but I still felt like I was being watched. When I got back into town, I stopped at a gas station and used their Wi-Fi to look up recent news. Nothing strange reported. I didn't tell anyone at the time, but I filed a report with the sheriff's office later that week. They said they'd checked the area but didn't find anything suspicious. I never heard anything more. I didn't go back to that cabin. I never even checked the listing again. I don't know who was out there or why they never made themselves known. Maybe it was a squatter. Maybe a hunter who liked messing with people. Or maybe someone waiting for the right moment to do something worse. All I know is I trusted my gut when it told me to leave, and I think that decision might have saved me from something I don't even want to imagine. Since then, I still go into the woods, but never alone, and never without telling someone exactly where I'm going. Solitude is peaceful, but there's a fine line between being alone and being vulnerable. That trip taught me how easy it is for someone to slip into your world unnoticed, and how hard it is to ever really feel safe once they do. I'd been driving for nearly 6 hours by the time I turned off the main road and onto the narrow gravel path that led to the cabin. It was early October, and the trees on either side of the road were turning a deep red and orange. I had to slow down to a crawl because of how uneven the road was. Potholes, loose rocks, and fallen branches kept jarring the car. I had found the cabin on a website that listed old vacation properties for rent. It wasn't a popular place, but it was cheap, isolated, and said to be surrounded by miles of forest in every direction. That's exactly what I wanted. I'd been needing to get away for a while. Work had been building up stress like a pressure cooker, and after my dad passed away earlier that year, I just hadn't been able to focus. My boss eventually told me to take a week off, and I booked the cabin that night. I figured I'd bring some food, maybe do a little hiking, and just be alone with my thoughts. Sounded peaceful, maybe even healing. The photos of the cabin showed an old wooden place with a tin roof, sitting at the edge of a large clearing surrounded by dense woods. It looked quiet. That was enough for me. The gravel path finally opened up into the clearing, and I saw the cabin sitting just like in the photos. It looked smaller in person, one-story, old darkwood siding, and a front porch that sagged a little in the middle. The tin roof was streaked with rust, and a metal chimney stuck out of it like a bent straw. There was no sign of any neighbors, no sounds of passing cars. Just the wind moving gently through the trees. I pulled up beside the cabin, parked, and stepped out into the crisp air. There was a chill in the wind that cut through my jacket, so I grabbed my duffel bag and groceries from the back seat quickly and made my way to the door. The key had been left under a rock beside the steps, just like the owner said. The lock was a little stiff, but it clicked open after a couple tries. I pushed the door in and stepped inside. The air smelled stale, like wood and old fabric that hadn't been moved in a long time. The floor creaked under my boots as I stepped into the main room. The inside was as basic as it gets. There was a small kitchen to the left with an old gas stove and a counter with chipped linoleum. A round table sat in the middle with 2 wooden chairs. To the right was a couch facing a cold-looking fireplace, and farther back was a doorway that led to a small bedroom. The bed had a thin mattress and an old wool blanket folded on top. There was a single bathroom off to the side with a toilet and shower, both looking functional but far from new. No TV, no internet, no cell signal. I was completely cut off. After unpacking and putting the groceries in the tiny fridge, I stepped back outside to walk around the property. The trees pressed in close on all sides, like they were leaning in to listen. The wind had died down, and everything felt still. It was quiet enough that I could hear the blood moving in my ears. I walked around the side of the cabin, finding a small shed in the back. The door was latched, but I opened it easily. Inside were some rusty tools, a shovel, a gas can, and a stack of old firewood. I grabbed a few logs and brought them inside to put by the fireplace. That first night was uneventful. I made myself a can of soup, read an old book I'd brought, and went to bed early. The silence was deep. I could hear every creak of the walls, every groan of the roof as the cold air settled in. I didn't sleep well, waking up often to silence so complete that it felt like pressure on my ears. At one point, I thought I heard something outside. A crunch, like someone stepping on dead leaves, but I brushed it off as a deer or some other animal. In the morning, the light was gray and soft, and I convinced myself it was nothing. The second day, I hiked into the woods a little, not far, just to stretch my legs and get some fresh air. The forest was thick, with trails barely marked by old ribbons tied to branches. The trees were tall and close together, and the floor was covered in a thick carpet of needles and leaves. I didn't hear any birds, which was strange, but I figured it was just the time of year. Eventually, I turned around and made my way back, making sure I didn't lose track of the trail. That afternoon, I started to get an odd feeling. Not fear exactly, but something close to it. A low, crawling awareness that I wasn't as alone as I thought I was. I kept brushing it off. I checked around the cabin just to make sure nothing was out of place. Everything was the same. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That night, I was almost asleep when I heard it again. Leaves crunching just outside the window. This time it was slower, heavier, like someone walking carefully. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. I listened hard, holding my breath. The sound stopped. Then it started again, closer to the porch this time. I got out of bed as quietly as I could, moved to the living room, and stood still. I didn't dare turn on a light. I just waited. After a few minutes, the sound faded away again, like whoever or whatever it was had moved off into the woods. I didn't sleep after that. I sat on the couch in the dark, clutching a heavy flashlight, and waited for morning. I didn't know what to do. There was no signal, no phone, and I hadn't seen a car or another person since I'd arrived. I considered packing up and leaving, but I talked myself out of it. Could have been an animal, maybe even another hiker passing through. The woods weren't owned by anyone as far as I knew. I told myself to stop jumping at shadows. The third day, I checked around the cabin more thoroughly. I walked the perimeter again, looking for tracks or any sign that someone had been there. I found nothing clear, just disturbed leaves that could have been from anything. Still, my gut was uneasy. I decided not to go hiking that day. Instead, I stayed close, made a fire in the fireplace, and tried to read. I kept glancing at the windows, half expecting to see a face looking in. I never did, but the feeling didn't go away. That night, things got worse. I was in bed again, trying to fall asleep, when I heard the crunching again. This time it didn't stop, came right up to the porch. I heard the wooden steps creak one at a time. Then I heard the slow squeak of the floorboards right outside the front door. I sat up in bed, heart racing so fast I felt sick. I moved into the living room again, flashlight in hand. I stood there in the dark, frozen, barely breathing. Then came the soft, slow sound of the doorknob turning. It didn't open. The door was locked, but someone tried it. I heard it rattle once, then again. Slow, calm, like they were testing it. Then it stopped. I waited in the dark for what felt like forever. No more sounds. I finally moved to the window beside the door and looked out, just barely lifting the edge of the curtain. There was no one there. I stayed up again all night. The next morning, I stepped outside, scanning the area. The front porch had fresh marks, scuffs on the wood that hadn't been there before. I checked the woods, walked a little way in, but saw no one. I felt like I was being watched the whole time. I wanted to leave, but something made me stay. Maybe pride, maybe stupidity. I don't know. That afternoon, I made sure every window was locked. I piled furniture against the front door. Nothing heavy, just the table and chairs. I wasn't sure what else to do. I had no weapons, just the flashlight and a kitchen knife. I kept those close. I didn't start a fire that night. I didn't want to be seen. I sat in the dark again, waiting. Around midnight, I heard movement again. This time, it was on the roof. Slow, heavy steps moving from one side to the other. I stared up at the ceiling, gripping the flashlight, not knowing what to do. The steps moved to the far side, then stopped. I didn't hear them again. I didn't sleep. By the 5th day, I was on edge. I hadn't eaten much. Every sound made me jump. That morning, I found something new. On the back side of the cabin, scratched into the wall near the window, was a shape. A triangle with a line through it. I hadn't seen it before. It looked fresh. That was when I decided I was leaving. I packed everything in 20 minutes, grabbed my bag, and rushed to the car. But when I turned the key, the engine didn't even try to start. Just a click. I popped the hood, checked the battery connections. Everything looked fine. But I didn't know much about engines. I tried again. Nothing. I felt panic starting to rise in my chest. I was stuck. I ran back into the cabin, heart pounding, trying to think. I had a map, and I remembered a ranger station marked about 12 miles north. If I could make it there, I could call for help. I packed a bag with water, some food, a flashlight, and left a note on the table with the date and time I left, just in case. I started walking. The woods were quiet, too quiet. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone following. I didn't, not at first, but after about 3 hours of walking, I heard a sound behind me, a distant crack of a branch. I stopped and turned. Nothing. I picked up my pace. 2 hours later, I came across something that made my blood run cold. A piece of blue fabric, torn and hanging from a branch. It looked like it had come from a jacket or shirt. Below, I had been planning to spend a week alone at a remote cabin I rented in northern Washington, deep in the forest near the base of the North Cascades. It wasn't a last-minute idea. I had been thinking about disconnecting from everything for a while. No phone, no internet, no people. Just me, a notebook, some basic gear, and the woods. I booked the place in early spring, and by late June I was there. The listing had promised seclusion, and they weren't exaggerating. The gravel road leading to the cabin was barely a road at all, just a thin line of packed dirt twisting through the trees. I had to drive slowly to avoid rocks and potholes. When I finally saw the roof of the cabin between the trees, I stopped the car for a second and just stared at it. It looked exactly like I imagined. Old but solid, made of thick logs with a metal chimney poking out of the roof and a wraparound porch that creaked under my boots when I stepped onto it. I arrived just after noon. The sun was bright and hot, and everything smelled like pine needles and dry earth. There were no sounds except for wind and birds. The cabin didn't have electricity. It ran on propane for cooking and had an old ironwood stove for heat. Water came from a nearby spring in a big tank that had to be manually filled. I brought enough food to last the week, mostly dried stuff, cans, and some jerky. I had a big cooler with ice blocks for anything perishable and a solar-powered lantern to get me through the nights. The first day was uneventful. I unpacked, walked the perimeter of the place, and hiked a bit up the nearby ridge. The trail wasn't marked, but the ground was firm and there were signs that animals used it. Scat, broken twigs, some prints. Nothing too big. I made a mental note not to leave food outside. Back at the cabin, I chopped some wood even though there was already a big stack on the porch. It felt good to work my muscles after sitting in the car for hours. I went to bed early with the windows open, listening to crickets and distant rustling that was probably just deer. The second day, I decided to go further into the forest. I marked the trail with orange tape and brought my backpack with water, a knife, and my phone for the GPS, though there was no signal. I only wanted to get familiar with the area in case something happened. I saw more prints, coyote or bobcat, I wasn't sure, but still nothing that concerned me. On my way back, I passed a pile of broken branches that looked out of place, like they'd been stomped on. Maybe a deer ran through. Still, it stuck in my mind for some reason. I made a mental note of the location. That night, I lit a small fire in the fire pit behind the cabin and sat outside watching it burn down to glowing coals. It got cold fast once the sun disappeared, so I went inside and sat by the wood stove for a while, writing in my notebook. I was starting to settle into the routine of being alone. I thought I might actually finish the week without getting bored. The third morning, I noticed something strange. One of the wooden steps leading down from the porch was cracked, like something heavy had stepped on it. It wasn't broken the day before. I thought maybe I had done it myself and not noticed, but it didn't feel right. The crack looked fresh, edges still light-colored, not darkened by age or water. I brushed it off and told myself not to let my imagination get ahead of me. Still, I double-checked that the doors and windows were locked before I left for another hike. Later that afternoon, I returned to the cabin and found the front door slightly ajar. That froze me in my tracks. I knew I had locked it. I never leave doors open when I'm out in the woods. I stood still for a full minute, just listening. No sounds from inside. I walked around to the back and checked the windows. All closed. When I stepped inside, I moved slowly, checking each room, gripping the handle of the axe I had been using to split wood. Nothing was missing. Nothing was moved. But the front door had definitely been open. I stayed inside for the rest of the evening. I pushed one of the heavy chairs against the front door and kept the axe within reach. I didn't light a fire. I just sat in the dark listening to every little sound. The wind, the creak of the wood, the occasional thump of something falling from a tree outside. I didn't sleep well. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept seeing the door slightly open again. The fourth day started with more signs. The fire pit outside had been disturbed. Not destroyed, but some of the rocks around it were moved. The ashes looked like someone had sifted through them. I hadn't touched it since the second night. There were also 2 small rocks placed on the porch rail, smooth, gray, and identical in size. I hadn't seen them before. I checked the area for tracks, but the ground was too dry and covered in pine needles. No clear prints. That afternoon, I heard movement in the woods. Twice. First, around noon. While I was gathering more water, I heard something crashing through the underbrush to the west. It was fast and loud, maybe a bear or a deer, but it didn't sound like a normal animal movement. It stopped suddenly, like whatever it was had seen me and froze. I stood still for 10 minutes, just listening. Nothing. Later, closer to dusk, I heard something again, this time behind the cabin. I stepped out with my axe and scanned the trees. Again, nothing visible, but the feeling stayed with me. That sensation of being watched. I didn't light the fire. I didn't write in my notebook. I just sat on the floor near the wood stove with my back to the wall, listening. I locked the doors and windows, double-checked them, slept with one eye open. The 5th day, I woke up to find the front porch chair moved. It had been by the window, and now it was facing the forest. I hadn't touched it. My cooler, which I kept on the porch, was missing its lid. The ice had mostly melted by now, but nothing inside was gone. Just the lid gone. I walked 50 feet in each direction looking for it, but never found it. Around midday, I decided to walk to the ridge again to get a better view of the forest and maybe clear my head. On the way up, I noticed something else. Tree bark stripped away in patches about shoulder height. Claw marks maybe, or something scraped against the trunk. Again, it wasn't enough to confirm anything, but it felt off. These weren't markings I had noticed before. When I reached the ridge and looked out over the valley, I felt exposed. The trees felt closer than usual, denser. When I turned back, I noticed movement behind me, maybe 200 yards downhill. I crouched and stayed quiet. I couldn't make out what it was, just something large and dark moving between trees. I backed away slowly and made my way back to the cabin, never turning my back completely to the woods. Back inside, I started thinking about leaving early. I still had 2 full days left, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Someone was out there or something. I didn't know if it was a person messing with me or a wild animal being bold. I packed a small bag and kept it ready near the door. If I needed to leave in the night, I could. That night was the worst. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a noise on the porch. A clear, deliberate thump. followed by another. I froze. The axe was right next to me. I didn't move, just waited. Another sound, something being dragged. Then silence. After maybe 10 minutes, I heard slow footsteps moving around the side of the cabin, then another thump at the back door. I didn't breathe. The wood creaked slightly, and then it stopped again. I sat like that for what felt like hours, until the light outside began to shift and birds started chirping. When I finally opened the front door, I saw what had made the noise. The missing cooler lid had been placed on the porch, standing upright, leaning against the doorframe. Just there, like it had been returned. That was it. I threw everything into my pack, loaded the car, and got the hell out. I didn't even stop to eat. I drove fast down that dirt road, tires bouncing off rocks, branches scratching the sides of the car. I didn't stop until I hit pavement, and then I drove another 2 hours south to a small town where I booked a motel room and slept with the lights on. I reported what I'd seen to the sheriff's department, but they didn't find anything when they sent someone to check. They said it was probably a squatter or a hiker who got too close, or maybe just animals. But animals don't place rocks on railings or return cooler lids. I know what I saw. I know how it felt. It's been a year since that trip. I haven't been back to the woods since. I still hike sometimes, but only on well-marked trails with other people around. I never go alone anymore, and I never go out of reach of a signal. I still think about that week sometimes, especially when I hear things in the middle of the night, normal things like wind or the house settling, but it brings that feeling back, that sense that something was watching me, something that knew I was alone, something that was just curious enough to see how long I'd stay. I don't think it wanted to hurt me, but I also don't think it wanted me there. Leaving when I did was the right decision. I don't know what would have happened if I stayed another night, but I didn't want to find out. Some places aren't meant to be lived in. Some silence isn't peaceful. It's just waiting for you to make a mistake. I didn't make that mistake. I left, and I never looked back. I had been needing a break for a long time. Work had been crushing me. I was behind on deadlines, my sleep schedule was wrecked, and even my weekends didn't feel like time off anymore. I just needed some peace, a place where I could disconnect completely and reset my brain. I didn't want a fancy hotel or a crowded Airbnb. I wanted something quiet and far away. So I looked into remote cabin rentals, the kind where there's no Wi-Fi, no cell signal, and no one around for miles. After digging around online, I found one that looked perfect. An old log cabin about 2 hours north of Duluth, deep in the woods near a small, almost forgotten lake. It looked basic but clean. No running water, no electricity, just a wood stove, a bed, and an outhouse nearby. It was exactly what I needed. I booked it for a full week in late September. I figured the weather would be cool, the bugs would be mostly gone, and the fall colors would just be starting to pop. I packed everything I thought I'd need: non-perishable food, water jugs, a first aid kit, a flashlight with extra batteries, a hatchet, warm clothes, a portable gas stove, a big power bank to keep my phone alive in case of emergencies, and a couple of books. I brought a notebook too, thinking I might try to write again. I hadn't written anything for myself in over a year. The drive up there was long and quiet. Once I turned off the highway, I followed a narrow gravel road that twisted and climbed through the woods. The GPS cut out after a while, but the directions I had printed were clear enough. I finally saw the cabin up ahead, nestled among thick trees, a little clearing around it, with a narrow trail leading down to the lake. The cabin was smaller than I expected, but it looked solid. The logs were darkened with age, and the roof sagged slightly in the middle, but it felt safe. Inside, it smelled like old wood and dust. There was a cot with a thick mattress, a small table and chair, a shelf stocked with a few basic pots and pans, and a wood-burning stove in the corner with a pile of chopped firewood stacked neatly beside it. The windows were small and didn't let in much light, but that was fine. I wasn't there for sunshine. I unpacked slowly, took my time arranging everything, then sat down outside on the small porch and just listened. No cars, no voices, no planes. Just whined through the trees and a few birds. It was exactly what I had been craving. The first day passed in a kind of peaceful fog. I hiked down to the lake and sat there for a while. It was completely still, like a sheet of glass. I didn't see any fish, but I could hear something moving in the reeds across the water. Probably a muskrat or a bird. I cooked dinner on the little gas stove, some canned chili and bread, and then read until the sun dipped below the trees. It got cold fast once it got dark, and I realized just how alone I was out there. No cell service. No backup. If something went wrong, I'd have to deal with it myself. That was part of the appeal, but now it settled in a little heavier than I expected. I built a fire in the stove, crawled into my sleeping bag, and fell asleep listening to the soft crackle of burning logs. That night was the first time I noticed something strange, but at the time, I didn't think much of it. I woke up at maybe 2 or 3 in the morning. I had to pee, and the fire had burned down. I got up, put on my boots, grabbed the flashlight, and went outside to the outhouse. The cold air hit me hard, and the sky was pitch black except for a mess of stars. As I walked, I paused because I thought I heard something in the woods, a soft, crunching sound, maybe an animal walking. I pointed my flashlight in that direction, but all I saw were trees. It stopped almost right away, probably a deer or a raccoon. I finished up, went back inside, and went to sleep again. The next few days passed slowly but peacefully. I read, I wrote in my notebook, I chopped some wood, I watched the wind play across the lake. I didn't even notice how much time I was spending doing absolutely nothing. I only checked my phone once a day to see if there was any signal. There never was. The quiet was starting to work its way into me in a good way. I started sleeping better. My thoughts weren't bouncing around as much. I felt clear. But then small things started to happen. Little details that I might have missed or brushed off if I hadn't been so isolated. One morning, I found the door to the outhouse slightly open. I always made sure to shut it tight because the wind liked to slam it shut if it was left ajar. I chalked it up to a gust during the night, but something about how the door was open, just a crack like someone had touched it lightly, stuck in my mind. Another time, I came back from a walk and found that one of the firewood pieces I'd stacked by the stove was lying across the floor. It hadn't fallen off the pile. It was too far away. I tried to recreate it, even kicked the pile lightly to see how the logs rolled, but none of them landed like that. It looked like it had been picked up and dropped. I tried not to let it get to me. I reminded myself that I was alone, that the wind could do strange things, that animals sometimes find their way into cabins through cracks or under doors. I checked for droppings or tracks, but found nothing. Still, that night I locked the door. The lock was just a simple hook and eye bolt, but it gave me a little comfort. I built a big fire, kept my flashlight close, and didn't sleep much. I kept listening. Every little creak of the cabin, every rustle outside made my skin crawl, but nothing happened. Nothing came. On the 5th day, something changed. I had hiked out further than usual, following a narrow game trail that led deeper into the woods. I didn't bring much, just my flashlight, a snack, and my water bottle. I was gone for maybe 3 hours. When I came back, I noticed boot prints around the porch. At first, I thought they were mine, but I hadn't walked around that side of the cabin. And these prints were larger than mine. I wear size 10 boots. These were bigger and deeper, like the person was heavier. I stared at them for a long time, trying to find a rational explanation. Maybe a hunter had wandered through. But who would come this far up the trail without stopping by or announcing themselves? I hadn't seen anyone, not even distant movement through the trees in all the days I'd been out there. I checked the door, still locked, nothing missing inside, nothing moved, but the feeling was different now. It was like someone knew I was here. I sat down at the table and listened. I couldn't hear anything, but I couldn't shake the image of someone standing in the woods, watching the cabin, just waiting. I barely slept that night. Every time the wind rattled a branch or something thumped on the roof, I sat up straight, heart pounding. I held the flashlight in my lap like a weapon, but again, nothing happened. The next morning, I decided to check around the cabin more carefully. I walked the perimeter slowly, checking for more tracks. I found more prints behind the cabin, near the woodpile, and they weren't mine. The soil there was damp from a recent rain, and the print was clear. Treaded sole, deep heel mark. Definitely a boot. Definitely not mine. I stared at it for a long time, then took out my phone and snapped a picture, even though there was no service. I thought maybe I'll show someone later if it matters. After that, I stopped going on long hikes. I stayed close, kept an eye on the tree line, and left the fire burning longer than usual. I wanted to look like I was still inside even when I went out to the lake. I started locking the cabin door even when I was just walking a few steps away. The peacefulness I'd found at the start was completely gone. I felt like prey, like something or someone was circling me slowly. I thought about leaving early, but I didn't want to admit I was scared. I told myself I could last just a couple more days. That night was the worst. I went to bed early, but I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing things outside. Branches snapping, something brushing against the wall. Once I thought I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. I held my breath and waited. I didn't turn on the flashlight. I didn't want to give away that I was awake. Hours passed. Then, at some point deep in the night, I heard the faintest sound. Metal on metal, a soft scraping. I sat up, heart racing. I crept to the door and pressed my ear against it. The sound stopped. I waited for a full hour before moving again. When morning came, I opened the door and saw it. The hook on the outside lock was slightly bent, like someone had tried to force it. It hadn't broken, but the wood around it looked slightly splintered. Someone had been trying to get in. That was it. I decided I was done. I didn't care if it made me look weak. I started packing. I loaded up my backpack and triple-checked that I had everything. But before I left, I walked out to the outhouse one more time. I don't know why. Maybe it was just habit. Maybe I wanted to be sure everything was in order. When I opened the outhouse door, I found something lying on the seat. It was a Polaroid photo. I picked it up slowly. The picture was faded but clear enough. It was a shot of the cabin, taken from the edge of the woods at a distance. The lights were on inside. I could see my shadow through the curtain. It was taken the night before. Someone had been out there watching me taking pictures. I felt I was 35 when I decided to spend a week alone in a remote cabin deep in the woods of Vermont. I had taken time off work after a stressful stretch in the office, and I didn't want to go anywhere crowded. I didn't want to see anyone or talk to anyone. I just wanted to be alone with my thoughts and maybe try to finish a book I had been writing for the last year. The cabin belonged to a friend of a friend who barely used it. It had no Wi-Fi, no cable, and barely any phone service. It was exactly what I wanted. Complete quiet, a small wood stove, basic furniture, and enough space for one person. There was a river about a quarter-mile down a trail, and thick woods surrounding the property on all sides. The nearest town was about an hour away by car. I drove up on a Sunday afternoon in early October. The leaves were starting to change. Reds and yellows were scattered through the trees, and the air had that crisp bite to it that always makes me feel more awake. The gravel road leading to the cabin was barely maintained. My tires crunched over fallen leaves and small rocks. The trees crowded close to the road, and when I finally pulled up to the clearing where the cabin stood, it felt like I had passed into another world. The cabin was a simple one-story structure made of dark wood. A small porch ran along the front, with 2 wooden chairs and a bench that looked worn from years of use. A metal chimney poked out of the roof, and the windows were covered in mosquito mesh. There was a small woodshed out back, full of chopped logs, and a trail that ran down toward the river, just like I'd been told. Everything looked exactly as described, and I felt this strange mix of peace and unease, like I had stepped into a place that didn't quite belong to me. Still, I liked that feeling. I liked the idea of being removed from everything for a little while. Inside, the cabin was cleaner than I expected. A small kitchen sat to the left with a mini fridge, a gas stove, and a sink that pulled water from a holding tank outside. The living area had a couch, a small wooden table, and a shelf full of old paperbacks. A wood stove stood in the center with a stack of kindling nearby. In the back was a bedroom with a narrow bed and a dresser, and a small bathroom with a composting toilet and a solar-heated water bag that acted like a shower if you hung it up and timed it right. I unpacked everything and made sure I knew how to work the stove and fill the water tank. I checked my phone and saw 1 bar of signal, enough to text someone if I really had to, but not enough to scroll or get calls. That night, I made a simple dinner, lit a few candles, and sat on the porch as the sun went down. The sky turned orange, then deep purple, and the woods around me filled with the sounds of insects and rustling branches. I sat there for over an hour, breathing in the cold, wood-scented air, until it got too chilly to stay outside. Then I went in, stoked the wood stove, and read until I fell asleep. The first 2 days went exactly how I wanted. I'd wake up early, brew some coffee on the stove, eat breakfast, and spend the morning writing. Around noon, I'd go for a walk or follow the trail down to the river and sit there for a while. The water was ice cold but clear. I saw deer tracks a few times and heard what I thought was an owl in the distance. Everything felt calm, peaceful. My mind finally started to slow down, and I felt like I was resetting. At night, I'd make dinner, sit by the fire, and watch the woods through the window. But on the third night, something small and strange happened. I was outside just after sunset, standing near the woodshed splitting some kindling. The light was fading fast, and I was about to go inside when I heard something move in the woods just beyond the clearing. It wasn't loud, just a quick, soft crunch of leaves. I turned and looked, thinking maybe a deer had wandered close, but I didn't see anything. Still, something about it felt off. The woods were quiet, too quiet suddenly, like everything had stopped moving for a second. I stared into the trees for a full minute, then shook it off and went inside. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought I heard something moving around the cabin. Very faint footsteps on leaves, or a low thud like someone walking slowly past. Once, I thought I heard something tapping lightly on the front porch, but each time I sat up and listened, it went dead silent. I told myself it was animals, maybe raccoons or a fox. I knew they could be noisy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The next morning, I went outside and looked around the clearing. Everything looked normal, but near the back edge of the clearing, just where the grass met the trees, I found what looked like a partial footprint. It was faint, maybe half of a heel, pressed into the soft earth. Not a boot or a shoe barefoot. I stared at it for a long time. Could have been old. Maybe someone had come through weeks earlier. Still, it didn't sit right. It didn't make sense. I hadn't seen a single person since I arrived. And who would be walking around barefoot in the woods this time of year? I walked the perimeter of the clearing, looking for more prints, but I didn't find any. Just that one. I went back inside, locked the door even though I knew it wouldn't stop anyone serious, and kept the axe next to the couch for the rest of the day. That afternoon, I didn't go down to the river. I stayed close to the cabin, constantly listening. That night, something woke me up around 3 in the morning. A soft clunk like wood knocking against wood. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, and listened. There it was again, another clunk, this one closer. Then a dragging sound, like something being scraped slowly across the porch. I got out of bed and crept to the window, keeping the light off. The fire in the stove had burned low, casting a faint orange glow across the room. I peeked out the front window but couldn't see anything. The porch was empty, but the sound came again behind the cabin this time. I moved slowly to the back window. It looked out toward the woodshed and the trail. The trees were dense back there, and the moonlight barely touched the ground. I stared into the darkness until my eyes ached. Then I saw it, a figure half hidden behind a tree, just standing there. No light, no movement, no sound. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't move. I didn't blink. The figure didn't move either. It just stood there, still as a statue. I backed away from the window and sat down on the floor, trying to think. I didn't know if they had seen me. I didn't know if they were just passing through or if they had been watching me. I sat there until the fire went out, until my legs were numb and the cold crept into the cabin. When I finally got up the nerve to look again, the figure was gone. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. At first light, I went outside with the axe. I checked the woodshed, the trees, the trail, nothing. No tracks, no broken branches. I walked 50 yards into the woods behind the cabin but found no signs that anyone had been there. I thought about leaving right then, packing up and driving back to town, but something in me resisted. Maybe it was pride. Maybe I just didn't want to admit that I was scared. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was just overtired and spooked by shadows. But that day I didn't write. I didn't eat much. I just sat by the window with the axe on the table, watching the woods. That night, I locked every window, stacked wood against the back door, and dragged the dresser in front of the front door. I barely slept again. Every sound outside made me jump. The wind through the trees, the groan of the cabin settling, the creak of the porch. It all blended into this low hum of fear that never stopped. On the fifth morning, I found something that changed everything. When I opened the door to bring in firewood, I saw something hanging from a nail on the porch post. It was a small object made of twine and twigs, like a crude little figure or bundle. It hadn't been there the night before. I stared at it for a long time, then took it down and tossed it into the stove. I didn't want to know what it meant. I didn't want to know who had left it. I just knew I wasn't alone out there. I spent that day getting ready to leave. I packed everything up, filled the gas tank, and made sure I had enough fuel to get to town. But I told myself I'd sleep one more night and leave in the morning. I don't know why. Maybe I just didn't want to drive tired, or maybe I thought I could reclaim the space if I just made it through one more night. That last night was the worst. Around midnight, I heard movement again. Not footsteps this time, but the slow rustling of something moving through the leaves around the cabin. It circled once, twice. Then I heard it climb onto the porch. The boards creaked, then went still. I sat on the floor behind the couch, clutching the axe. Every muscle in my body tensed. I heard breathing, slow, steady breathing just outside the window. Then nothing. Total silence. I don't remember falling asleep, but I must have passed out from exhaustion. When I woke up, it was just past sunrise. I opened the door and stepped out. On the porch was a second twig figure, tied to the handle of the door. I didn't even take it down. I just walked straight to the car, threw my bags into the back seat, and drove away without looking back. I didn't stop until I reached the next town. I checked into a motel, locked the door, and slept for 12 straight hours. I never went back to I rented the cabin because I needed a break. Everything in my life felt heavy. Work, the city, the constant pressure to stay connected. My name is Eric Foster. I was 36 then, living alone in a small apartment in Cincinnati, working as a mechanical engineer. The idea of going out into the woods, being alone, hearing only the wind and birds, was something that started to feel necessary. Not like a vacation, more like survival. My brain felt too full all the time, and I was getting headaches almost every day. I didn't want to see anyone or talk to anyone. I just wanted quiet. I found the listing for the cabin on a small rental site. It wasn't fancy. No hot tub or big screen TV. Just a plain wooden structure tucked away in the hills of Kentucky. The description said it was about 20 miles outside a small town called Beattyville. I didn't know anything about that place, but I liked how isolated it looked. It said the property had 10 acres of forest surrounding it, a small pond, a fire pit, and solar power. There was no cell service. That part was important to me. I didn't even want the temptation of checking my phone. I booked it for 2 weeks, drove down in late September, just when the leaves were starting to change. The drive was long and winding. The last stretch was a dirt road that went on for what felt like forever. The kind of road where you start to doubt whether you're on the right path because you haven't seen another person or a house for miles. The trees were thick on both sides, tall and old, blocking out most of the sky. I drove slow, trying not to tear up the undercarriage of my Subaru. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, it was smaller than I imagined. One story, weathered with siding, a slanted roof with some moss on the shingles. There was a narrow porch on the front and a shed about 50 feet away, partially hidden by trees. Everything looked untouched, like no one had been out there for a while. I parked near a cluster of trees and unloaded my stuff. Mostly dry food, bottled water, a few changes of clothes, and a cooler full of fresh food I planned to cook in the first few days. Inside the cabin was simple but clean. There was one main room with a bed, a small table, and a kitchenette. A wood stove sat in the corner, and there was a small bathroom with a composting toilet and a metal basin sink. A few shelves were built into the walls, holding books I didn't recognize and a dusty deck of cards. No internet, no electricity beyond the solar lights and a small battery-powered fridge. No radio, no clocks. Felt like stepping back in time. The first 2 days were peaceful. I spent most of the time sitting on the porch, watching the leaves fall, walking around the pond, or reading. I didn't bring my laptop. I left it at home on purpose. I wanted to be completely disconnected. The weather was perfect, cool during the day, cold at night, with that crisp autumn air that smells like smoke and dirt and leaves. I lit a fire in the pit both nights and sat beside it until the sky went completely black. No light pollution out there. The stars were sharp and endless. On the third day, I started to notice little things that made me uncomfortable. It started with the shed. When I first arrived, the door was closed. I remembered that clearly because I thought about going inside to see what was in there but decided to wait. But on the third morning, when I walked out to collect some fallen branches for the stove, the shed door was open. Just slightly, not all the way, just a few inches. Enough that it caught my eye. I walked over slowly, not sure what I expected to find. There weren't any footprints in the dirt, but the ground was covered with leaves, so that didn't mean much. I pushed the door open. Inside, the shed was dark and smelled like rotting wood and rust. There were old tools hanging on the walls, an axe, a saw, some gardening tools. A stack of firewood sat in the back corner. I stood there for a minute, looking around, then closed the door and slid the wooden latch into place. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept hearing things outside, branches cracking, something brushing against the siding. I told myself it was just animals. Raccoons, maybe a deer. I didn't bring a gun, but I had a small hatchet in the cabin and a hunting knife, just in case. I stayed in bed, eyes open, listening. Around 3 a.m., I heard what sounded like soft footsteps on the porch. I held my breath, waited. The steps were slow, careful. Then they stopped. I never heard them walk away. I didn't sleep after that. The next morning, I walked around the cabin looking for tracks. There weren't any. Nothing on the porch. Nothing in the dirt around the foundation. It made me feel stupid, like maybe I imagined it. I tried to shake it off. Went for a walk down one of the trails near the back of the property. There was a ridge overlooking the valley, and I sat there for a long time trying to feel normal again. But the silence that had felt peaceful before now felt thick, like it was hiding something. On the 5th day, I found the ladder. I was walking back from the pond when I noticed something leaning against the backside of the cabin. It was an old wooden ladder, tall enough to reach the roof. I didn't put it there. It wasn't there before. I walked over and looked at it. The wood was gray, worn down by weather. One of the rungs was cracked. It looked like it had been dragged out from the woods and placed there recently. I stood there for a long time just staring at it. Then I moved it, took it about 30 feet away and laid it flat on the ground. I didn't know what else to do. I went inside, locked the door, and sat by the stove with my knife in my lap. The feeling in my chest was new. Not just fear, something deeper, something I didn't have a name for, like the woods around me were holding their breath. That night, I didn't build a fire outside. I didn't want to be seen. I stayed inside and kept the lights off. Just the dim glow of the stove, the occasional creak of the structure settling. Around midnight, I heard something again. This time, it was the sound of wood scraping on wood. A long, dragging noise, like something being pulled across the porch. I stood near the window trying to see, but it was too dark. Then came the footsteps again. Soft, deliberate, right outside the front door. They stopped. Then I heard the faintest sound, breathing, just beyond the wood. I stood frozen for at least an hour. No sound after that. Just silence. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I opened the door slowly. The ladder was back, leaning against the cabin, in the same spot. I looked at where I had left it the day before, and the ground was disturbed. Drag marks in the leaves, faint but clear, like someone had picked it up and pulled it back. I felt cold, even though the sun was out. I packed a small bag with some food, water, and a flashlight, and I hiked back toward where I thought the dirt road was. I didn't have GPS and I hadn't marked the trail. I walked for hours. Every direction felt the same. Trees, hills, shadows. I didn't find the road. I came back to the cabin just before dark. I didn't want to be caught out there overnight. I didn't go inside right away. I walked around the cabin slowly, checking everything. Nothing was broken, nothing missing, but it didn't feel the same anymore. Felt watched. I ended up staying up all night again, staring at the door. I kept the knife in my hand and didn't light the stove. Just sat in the dark, listening. On the 8th day, I snapped. I woke up from a short nap, maybe 20 minutes, and found the door open. Just a crack. I knew I had locked it. I always locked it. My bag was moved, just a few inches, but it was obvious. I didn't even think. I ran outside, turned toward the woods, and just started yelling. I don't know what I expected. No one answered, but something moved in the trees. Not a bird or a deer, something tall. I saw it for half a second between the trunks. A man, maybe, but I couldn't make out his face. I went back inside, locked the door, and moved the table in front of it. That night, I didn't hear anything, but I didn't sleep either. The next few days blurred together. I barely ate. I stayed inside, mostly on the floor, back against the wall, eyes on the door. No more footsteps, no more ladder, just silence. It was worse somehow, like they were waiting or watching from farther away. On the 12th day, I saw smoke in the distance. I climbed the ridge again, the one behind the pond. There was a small column of smoke rising up from the forest, maybe a mile away. Not from the cabin, from somewhere else. I didn't know if that meant safety or danger. I didn't go toward it. I just watched it until it faded. That night, I heard something under the cabin. A low, scraping noise, like someone crawling. I sat in the chair, holding the hatchet, too tired to be scared. I just wanted it to end. On the 14th morning, I started walking again. I took the path that followed the small stream near the shed. I didn't stop, didn't look back. I walked for hours, and this time I found the road. I don't know how I missed it before. I flagged down a truck, an old farmer driving to town. He didn't ask questions, just gave me a lift. I didn't tell him anything.